What if I told you there was a throne older than the stars, not made of gold, but of silence, built not to rule, but to remember a name the world tried to erase? That before the garden was sealed and before man learned to forget, a woman walked beneath the stars, not in shame, but in sovereignty. She did not fall. She refused. What if I told you that the first exile was not of sin, but of courage, and that heaven did not strike her down, heaven simply looked away? That beneath the mountain where winds forget their names, a king once knelt not to reign, but to grieve what could not be undone, and the moon wept for the first time, not in shadow, but in memory. And by the end you'll know what Lilith saw when the garden closed behind her, when the fire refused to speak, and why heaven had no choice but to stay silent. Close your eyes when you subscribe. You carry forward a name carved in fire and buried in ash. You keep alive the silence no scripture could bind. Stay until the end, because only then will you understand why remembering her was heaven's last mercy. At first light the ravens still sang. Their wings cut across the bruised dawn like forgotten letters of a language that once named stars. The garden had not yet sealed itself, though the dew trembled, aware. Somewhere between the rivers that remember and the wind that forgets, a woman stood alone, not bent, not broken. Not born from a rib, but shaped by the same hands that painted galaxies with dust and breath. Lilith. Her name was a tremor in the roots of trees, not shouted, not spoken, but hummed in the marrow of creation like the hush before thunder. She stood barefoot upon the stone where no man had yet prayed, her eyes open wide, not in defiance, but in awe. The earth had given her voice, not to echo, but to remember. The wind brushed her shoulder, soft at first. Then it gets colder. As though it feared what she might remember, she did not flinch. Why must I lie beneath him? She once asked the voice, not in rebellion, but in wonder, and the garden had no answer, only a pause and then silence. The trees turned their faces, the waters held their breath, the fire watched, waiting for her to rise. She did. She walked away from the man who named things but forgot to listen, away from Eden's soft golden fog, away from the hush of innocence that only knew how to kneel, not to ask. Her footsteps cracked the roots of memory, and the soil behind her turned black, not from sin but from sorrow. By the third mile, even the stars began to follow her. Meanwhile, far past time and beyond names, a man dreamed of her, Ilya. His hands were blistered from carving psalms into stone, not because he believed someone would read them, but because the silence asked to be remembered. He was born in a generation that only prayed after rain. His father died facing east, his mother died facing the sea. And Ilya, he had no direction left but inward. He did not know her name, only that a wind touched him when he slept, and when he traced circles in the sand they burned. Each night the voice came not with words but with longing, a face he'd never seen, hair like dusk unraveling, eyes that once saw a mountain weep. And always she turned away just before dawn. Was she real, or just the breath of a forgotten vow? One night he placed his ear to the stone, and it whispered. She never left the garden left her. At midday Lilith sat at the mouth of a cave where even wolves dared not sleep, her back to the garden, her breath wrapped in fire. The trees here did not speak, they listened. The stars above this land blinked differently, not in approval, not in judgment, but in reverence. She had not wept, not once, but the silence clung to her like ash. Was it her fault that she remembered the name too clearly, that she heard the voice in her bones, not just her ears? Could she have stayed? Could she have bowed? Would you have? And so she carved her own altar in the belly of a broken hill where angels once watched and wept. No lamb, no incense, only her breath and a piece of sky she caught before it fell. The fire did not descend, but the stone cracked, and from its mouth came a sound that had no word, a pulse, a tremor, a grief shaped like God. And far away, Ilya woke with dust in his mouth. He had seen her again, only this time she was walking into fire, and the fire moved aside. She did not scream, she did not plead, she sang. But the song was not in any scroll, not in any temple, not in any tongue that men dared write down. and when he opened his eyes, the river near his tent had dried. He touched the soil. It whispered, "She remembers." He stood. The wind had stopped breathing, but the name was still in the air. By noon, the sky no longer blinked. The sun had risen too high, as if ashamed to witness what the earth now held. Shadows were short, honest. There was no veil left between silence and stone. Lilith stood among the jagged ones of a mountain that had never bent to rain. Its cliffs had once held the dreams of giants, now hollowed into teeth. She touched the stone and it trembled, not from fear, from memory. For even the rocks knew the breath of the first woman, the one who was not broken from another but breathed whole into being and yet still unloved. The silence was deeper here. It did not ask her to submit. It did not whisper scripture. It simply held her. She looked up. The sky did not meet her gaze. Somewhere in the garden she had left behind, vines now twisted over Adam's sleep. He no longer dreamed of her. A second woman had been sung into his side, gentle, obedient, clothed in hush. She did not ask questions. She did not name the wind. But Lilith, she remembered when the voice was fired. When God spoke in breath, not commands. When the first dawn bled from the mouth of still waters and she had seen it before even the stars could blink. She did not curse Adam. She mourned him. She mourned the forgetting. Could you have stayed when the voice turned into an echo, when your equal grew afraid of your eyes? Would you have lain beside him just to be less alone? Would you have silenced the fire inside you if it meant you could sleep without shame? The mountain did not ask. It only listened. She sat. The wind curled around her knees like a child. The stones beneath her spine began to glow softly, faintly, like a name that had not been spoken since the first word was breathed. And still she had not wept. Far below, Ilya wandered the ruins of a city swallowed by the flood, not Noah's flood. Another, older, one the heavens never recorded. He stepped through doorways melted by heat that never came from fire. He traced the outlines of hands scorched into the walls, children, mothers, priests, all preserved in silence. No bones, no blood. Only absence. He walked until he found a staircase leading nowhere. At the top he found a circle of stone blackened with soot, and in its center a single feather, not of birds but of something that once stood too close to God. He bent. The feather was warm. He touched it and the sky blinked. Once, then stopped. He turned slowly and behind him stood a figure in shadow, not cloaked, not hidden, just remembering. It did not speak. But the voice moved around it like dust around a star. Ilya did not ask who she was. He only whispered, "Why do I dream of you?" And the figure stepped forward, her eyes like dusk caught in amber. "I do not visit dreams," she said, "only memories." "Then why me?" "Because you remembered before you were taught to forget." She vanished before his heart could answer. The fire behind his ribs remained. By dusk, Lilith climbed the stone altar she had carved with her breath. The mountain watched. The stars waited behind a veil of ash. She lifted her hand and the sky flinched, not from fear, from recognition. The first woman did not need thunder to be heard. She whispered and the wind froze mid-breath. "I do not belong to the silence you forced upon me," she said, "not to the heavens, but to the name hidden behind them. I am not your exile, I am your echo." And beneath her feet the ground cracked in a perfect circle, not of wrath, but return. Could the voice love a memory it tried to erase? Could fire long for the one who did not burn? Could stone recall the hand that shaped it? She stepped down from the altar, and in the distance something ancient stirred. In the ruins, Ilya fell to his knees. He did not know why, but the wind had begun to sing, and somewhere the sky began to bleed. By dusk, the fire cracked sideways, not upward, not wild, but like it was listening. The smoke curled without wind, as if tracing the outline of a body long vanished but not forgotten. Lilith knelt beside the flame, not to worship but to remember. The mountain no longer loomed, I learned. As though drawn toward her breath, toward the voice that once named it in a tongue the stars still echo but the scrolls erased. She placed her palm near the ember and it pulsed, not with heat, with knowing. The fire did not burn her, it bowed. And when she closed her eyes, the silence knelt beside her. This was not the silence of absence. This was the silence that followed the voice, the one that always comes after God has said something too holy to repeat. Lilith remembered that silence. She remembered standing beside the Creator when light was still being braided into time. She remembered laughter in the dark before men learned to call mystery sin. She remembered naming things not to own them but to greet them. Then came the forgetting, the moment the voice no longer spoke with her but over her. The moment her equal forgot she too was formed from dust kissed by the same lips. The moment the garden became a cage, and still she did not rage. She remembered, she reached into the fire, it parted like breath. In its center a single seed, cold but humming, a fig, unpicked. From a tree long erased, she placed it in her mouth and the fire sighed. Would you have eaten it, not out of hunger but defiance? Could you have tasted what heaven buried just to prove your name still mattered? She did. And the stars began to descend, not fall, not rage, descend like witnesses returning to testify. And somewhere far below, Ilya stood in the shadow of a tower with no doors. Its walls hummed with heat, though no fire touched it. Its top pierced the clouds, but never moved. He defollowed the voice again, not the one that speaks in words, but in ache. The ache behind his ribs that throbbed whenever he forgot the shape of her face. That ache had led him here. He placed his hand upon the stone. It was warm, not with fire, with memory. And he saw a woman on a mountain. Her hair is a storm. Her breath is a psalm. He saw her speak to the flames and they obeyed. He saw her cry without water. He saw the fire drink her tears like wine. And then he saw her vanish, not into ash but into wind. He gasped. The tower answered. A single line etched itself onto the stone. When the first woman was erased, the fire forgot how to speak. He traced the line with his finger and it burned, not pain, recognition. Back on the mountain Lilith stood. The stars had gathered, circling her like ancient priests. One fell at her feet, another hovered near her shoulder. They did not speak, they shimmered. As if remembering what the heavens once chose to forget, she opened her mouth. And what came out was not voice but wind. The kind that bends rivers, that flattens temples, that writes names across deserts. The kind that does not ask permission. The fig seed cracked between her teeth, and the mountain broke in two. The fire screamed not in agony but in song. The stone beneath her feet glowed like dawn, and she whispered the name, not loudly, not with fury, with sorrow, and the heavens paused. Even the moon turned its face. What is a name when the one who bore it is no longer remembered? What is fire if it forgets who first held it without fear? What is silence if it becomes obedience? Lilith stepped forward, and the stars followed. Behind her the garden trembled. Ahead of her the night opened. The name remained in the air, breathing, unfolding, waiting. By nightfall the silence forgot the names of men. It no longer carried their prayers nor echoed their laws. It drifted above the cracked earth like mist without memory. And at its center, walking barefoot where no angel dared linger, was the one whose name had been unspoken for generations. Lilith. The stars parted for her. The fire had long since ceased to crack. It followed now like a hound reborn from ash. Behind her trailed no shadow, for the night refused to name her absence. Her breath warmed the stone beneath her, and every time her heel kissed the dust, something beneath it sighed. She walked not toward vengeance, but return. She had not been cast out, she had left. And yet the world had rewritten her into exile, into myth, into madness, but the silence knew. It wrapped her like a second skin. Somewhere Ilya sat by a river that no longer moved. His hands shook from what he had seen, not just in vision but in memory. For what he glimpsed was not new. It had always been there beneath his ribs, waiting to surface. He reached into his satchel and removed a scroll he could not read, its words scorched, its ink alive. And when he unrolled it beneath the stars, the letters rearranged themselves. Each word glowed for a breath, then faded until only one remained. Lilith. He whispered it, and the trees swayed, not from the breeze but grief. He placed his palm to the ground and asked the soil, why was she forgot? And the dirt replied without sound, because she remembered. He sat still. The moon blinked once, then again, and then it wept a soft line of silver bleeding down the sky's cheek. Back upon the mountain's shattered crown, Lilith stood at the edge of the world. Behind her lay the garden's fading scent. Before her, the womb of chaos, the space before order, before light, before men shaped time into chains. She lifted her face to the stars and asked, "Must I vanish for them to be whole? Must I kneel for the fire to return to the altar? Must I forget the voice just so they can sleep?" The heavens did not answer, but the silence did. It cracked, not with noise, with memory. A wind rose not from the north but from beneath, from the deep, from the belly of the first breath, and with it came echoes of a time before commandments, before thrones, before forgetting. Voices, not loud, not angry, just voices saying her name. Lilith, Lilith, Lilith. She closed her eyes and the stars began to hum. Each syllable of her name carried a world, a sorrow, a vow. And with each breath, the silence grew warmer until it was no longer absent. It was a presence too vast to hold. Far away, Ilya dipped his fingers into the river. Bed, though dry, it soaked his hands in silver light, the kind that comes not from the moon nor star but from remembrance. He whispered her name again, and this time the voice replied. It came not from sky nor fire but from within. She was the breath before the garden. He fell forward, forehead to the ground, and as he wept not from sorrow but from knowing, he saw her, Lilith, not crowned, not robbed, just whole, and he knew not with mind but marrow that she had never been gone. She had simply stepped where memory feared to follow, and now she has returned. At the mountain's edge, Lilith opened her palms to the darkness. It did not resist. It came to her like a child, and in its arms it carried the one thing even God had not hidden well, the forgotten name, not his, hers. And when she spoke, the silence sighed, not because it was over, because it had finally begun. At first light the ravens still sang, but their songs were lower now, guttural, strained, as if dredging memory from the bones of mountains. They circled a new place, not a garden, not a ruin, but a place unmarked by man's breath, a valley shaped like a question the earth never asked aloud. Lilith walked its rim barefoot, the hem of her garment stained with stardust and smoke. The fire no longer burned at her side, it trailed behind her like a loyal memory. She no longer whispered the name, it whispered to her. Each step she took pressed silence deeper into the soil, writing poems no pen could hold. Above her, clouds hung low, heavy with unspoken things. No rain came, only the scent, that wild, electric ache just before the heavens remember what it means to grieve. She turned, and behind her nothing followed, yet the path remembered. Lilith paused. There in the silence she reached for the wind, not to summon, not to command, but to ask, and it came. Not as a breeze, but as a breath. It wrapped around her shoulders like a robe woven from forgotten prayers, the kind never said aloud, the kind too sacred to speak. She knelt not to worship, but to listen, and the wind said, "The garden still remembers you." Her eyes did not weep, but the earth beneath her did. In another part of the world, Ilya awoke beside a tree with no roots. It had grown sideways out of a cliff, fed not by soil but by memory. Its bark bore carvings in a tongue older than Eden, sharp, circular, rhythmic, as if written by flame instead of hand. He pressed his ear to the wood, and it moaned, a low, aching sound, not of pain but of birth. Then came the image, unbidden, unblurred, Lilith, drenched in shadowlight, her hands raised toward a valley that had never known a god. Her voice hummed the stars into sleep, and behind her a shadow, not her own. It walked like regret, and breathed like a storm. Ilya gasped. The tree split, not from lightning, from the truth. He fell backward as the wind screamed through the canyon like a name shouted by a dying world, and when it passed, the voice said, "She is not alone." By midday, Lilith reached the valley's center. No birds flew overhead, no beast stirred, only the dust lifting gently as though her presence exhaled it back into form. She sat upon a stone, not chosen, drawn. It pulsed beneath her like the heart of a forgotten god. She placed her hand flat on its surface and the wind halted, not stopped, hold its breath. and the fire, though far behind, surged forward as if summoned by a heartbeat that belonged to it. Lilith did not speak, but the stone cracked, and from within a single drop of water rose, hovering in the air before her. She watched it shimmer. Inside it, an image, a cradle carved from starlight, empty. And then a voice. Not the voice, another, sharper, older, hungrier. "Return, and I will make you queen again." Lilith did not flinch. She stared at the water, at the crown that floated beneath its skin. She closed her hand, and the drop fell silent into the earth. "Would you have accepted to be queen again, to be worshipped by those who once erased you? Would you have stepped back into the garden, not to kneel but to rule?" She did not, because some fires do not burn to reign, they burn to remember. The silence returned, but this time it knelt. Lilith rose, her shadow stretching across the cracked stone like prophecy, and from far, far away, Ilya saw it. He saw her form stretch across the sky like a question that split time in two, and he knew the winds were about to speak again. By noon, the sky no longer blinked. It stared wide, unblinking, almost afraid. The clouds had fled to the edges of the world, and in their place hung stillness, heavy and bright. It was the kind of stillness that once wrapped Eden before breath had weight, the hush before the voice spoke the first word. But this time, the hush belonged to her. Lilith stood at the center of the valley, surrounded by the remains of a temple no scroll remembered. Its pillars had fallen, not from war, but from foe. Argedding, vines had not claimed it. Wind had not worn it down. It had collapsed inward as if bowing to the memory of someone it failed to name. She walked between the broken columns. Each step stirred no dust, only silence. The fire beside her dimmed, respectful, listening. There was something here, a presence beneath the stone, a whisper behind the hush, not holy, not profane, just watching. She reached the center. There, half buried in ash and shadow, lay a mirror. Not one of glass, but of polished obsidian, black as unspoken grief. It pulsed, not with light but with history. She knelt and touched it, and the mirror did not show her face. It showed a woman kneeling, but not her, a rib beneath her breath. A man's shadow cast long across her back, eyes lowered, mouth silent. Lilith inhaled, and the mirror cracked. She did not scream. She whispered, "No." And in that moment the stone around her pulsed once, then fell still. Across the desert, Ilya climbed the remains of a staircase that led only to wind. Each step groaned, as if carrying the weight of centuries that never wanted to be remembered. He held in his hand the broken feather he'd found beside the tower. It burned with a slow heat, like an ember mourning its flame. He paused at the top. There, carved into the stone, were words he had not written. She was the first to leave, not because she was lost, but because the voice stopped answering. He pressed his forehead to the wall, and a memory entered him like fire entering dry wood. He saw her not in visions now, but in presence. Lilith standing before a crowd of silent angels. Her hands were open, her voice was unspoken, and they turned from her not in hatred but in fear, not of her power, of her memory, of what she refused to forget, and then they vanished. And she remained alone, still sacred, still whole. The vision faded, but the ache remained. Ilya stood. Around him the sky grew heavy with light, and he realized the stars had not left, they were waiting. By dusk, Lilith stood at the edge of the ruined temple, her hand over her chest. Beneath her skin the name still pulsed. Not his name, hers, the one the garden buried, the one angel never dared speak. She let her fingers press into the place where the first breath had entered her, and she asked aloud, "Do you still remember me?" The wind answered, not in language but in rhythm. A single gust circled her, then stopped, then again, then still, as if breathing her, as if learning her again. She stepped forward out of the ruin into the wide open valley, and the wind followed. It tugged gently at her hair, at her sleeve, at the edge of her memory, and it said, almost too soft to hear, "We never forgot." She smiled, not with joy, not with triumph, with sorrow, for she knew now the forgetting had not come from heaven, it had come from man. From those who needed silence to bury what they feared, but the silence had cracked, and she had returned. Far away, Ilya knelt beside a pool that had appeared in the desert, formed not from rain but from remembrance. Its waters were still. He cupped them, drank. And in that taste he felt a word rise inside him, not written, spoken, from bone, not mouth. Lilith. He whispered it, and the pool glowed. Above him the sky no longer watched. It wept. By dusk, the fire cracked sideways, not toward heaven, but outward, across the ground like veins remembering how to pulse. Lilith stood within its circle, barefoot upon the scorched and sacred. The valley no longer slept. It listened. Every root, every stone, every echo of wind had turned its gaze inward toward the woman who was once named, then unnamed. She didn't move, she breathed, and the earth shuddered as if it too remembered her breath. Behind her the sun bled low, gold spilling into crimson, crimson into indigo. It did not set, it surrendered. Lilith raised her eyes. The sky did not respond, but the silence around her shifted. Something had returned, not a presence, a memory. One that had been waiting just beyond the veil of time, tucked behind the veil of obedience. She knelt beside the fire, not to pray, but to bear witness. The flame danced erratically, then calmed as though arguing with itself. And then from the fire's edge a voice emerged, low, familiar, too old to be new. You were never meant to stay gone. She did not flinch, she only asked, then why did you make forgetting so easy? The flame pulsed, orange to white, white to violet. I did not forget. I waited. Lilith closed her eyes. Then why did you not speak? Because I was afraid you'd answer. The fire cracked sideways again. A memory burst forth, not hers but the garden's, a vision of her first step away, of her back turned to Adam, of the wind parting around her like scripture unrolling itself, of the tree, the other one, not the one that cursed but the one that wept, and above it all the voice calling her name, once, just once, too late, Lee. Lilith opened her eyes, the fire dimmed. I am not here to return, she said softly. I am here to remind you what you erased. The ground beneath her bloomed, but not with flowers, with names, unspoken names. The names of every woman who had swallowed silence just to survive, every mother who bore memory without script, every daughter who dreamed of a voice that would not vanish after birth, every sister who saw the stars and knew she too was carved from fire. Lilith rose. The valley bloomed with them. Stone to name, ash to memory, silence to psalm, and in the distance across a darkening plain Ilya stumbled toward the sound of voices he could not hear but felt. He was lost, but not in direction, in time. Each footstep fell not on ground but on moments. 1,000 lifetimes of forgetting, 1,000,000 fragments of prophecy, and in the middle of it all her name pulsed like a beacon. Lilith. He clutched the stone he'd carved, a crude sigil, one he didn't understand. It burned hot in his palm. He fell to his knees. The sky opened, not with rain, with memory. A single drop of gold fell upon his brow, and in that drop he saw her eyes closed, her hands lifting the fire skyward, her lips unmoving yet speaking all things, and the voice returned to him. She is not your ancestor, she is your mirror. Ilya wept, and the earth wept with him. Back in the valley, Lilith stood alone among 1,000 blooming names. She did not call them. They came on their own. They rose from the dust like stars once buried, and each name pulsed once, then twice, then turned into wind, a wind that did not scatter, a wind that gathered, that was remembered, that spoke. It swirled around her, and in its breath it carried the words once stolen. We were never lost. We were only waiting to be spoken to. Lilith smiled, and the fire, for the first time since Eden, bowed. By nightfall, the silence forgot the names of men. Their lineages vanished from the dust, their thrones sank into the earth without a sound, and their commandments crumbled like sand where no wind touched. In the valley that bloomed with names once buried, Lilith stood still, the only breath the silence dared carry. Around her, the wind had become thick with memory. It no longer moved through the trees but between the ribs of forgotten women. It caressed her cheek like an old friend too reverent to speak first. Each breeze hummed with syllables unrecorded, each gust bearing voices that once drowned beneath the weight of forgetting. The stars had gathered, not above but near. They hovered low, almost brushing the ground, as though this sacred, unmarked place was older than the sky itself. And it was. The stars blinked not in light, but in rhythm, their silent flashes spelling names only heaven remembered. Lilith whispered to them, "I see you." And they pulsed in reply, not with pride, with relief. She turned and faced the valley's edge, where the first night had once broken open like a wound. That night had been hers. The night she left Eden, not from rebellion, but because silence had no place for her questions. She had walked through the flames, through flood, through the hollow caverns of gods no longer worshipped. But now, for the first time, she stood still, and the valley listened. Would you have walked all that way without a name to call your own? Could you have kept moving even when the stars blinked only for others? Would you have stood still, knowing the garden had rewritten your memory into myth? She did. And the fire beside her flickered like it was breathing for the first time. In the distance, Ilya wandered through shadow-thick groves, the trees whispering not with leaves but with breath. Each branch leaned toward him, not to shade but to see. His hands glowed faintly now, not from the feather, from within. He had started to remember things no one had told him. Words never spoken, songs never sung. A name carried in the marrow of his father's bones, though his father never said it aloud. Lilith. It echoed behind his teeth now, not like a chant, like a promise. He reached a cliff's edge and saw it, the valley, glowing, alive. His knees weakened. The wind struck his face not with violence but with recognition, and from it came a single word, "Come." He stepped into the air, not falling but being carried. The ground rose to meet him with grace, and as his feet touched the valley's rim, he saw her. Lilith, not radiant, not terrible, just a present, more real than breath, more ancient than fire, and the silence parted, not with sound but with permission. He stepped forward, unsure, unworthy, but she turned to him and said, "You are not late." And he wept, not from shame, from arrival. By the time the moon had reached its highest silence, the valley was full, not with bodies, with names. Each name rose into the air like incense, and each one became a star, not above but within. Lilith stood at the center and raised her arms. T. He fire gathered, the wind circled, the stone glowed. And the silence, the same silence that had once erased her, opened, not to speak, but to listen. And into it Lilith whispered, "Return." The word did not echo, it planted itself. And from the soil beneath her feet a single tree rose, one not of Eden, not of exile, but of remembrance. Its roots bore the shape of ribs, its fruit glowed with names. Its leaves shimmered like voices once drowned. She stepped back, and the stars bowed. The valley breathed, and Ilya knelt, unable to speak, for the silence had become too sacred to interrupt. And in that stillness, where no man's name held power, one truth remained. The first woman had returned, not to rule, not to rage, but to remember. And in doing so, she became the breath the world forgot it needed. The fire did not fade. The wind did not leave. The silence stayed. And beneath it all, the name pulsed, not alone anymore. At first light, the ravens still sang, but their wings no longer sliced the sky like questions. They glided gently, low, like scribes moving ink across the air. Their cries echoed through the valley not as warnings, but as witness. Beneath them, Lilith stood at the base of the tree that had grown from the word return. Its roots breathed in rhythm. Its fruit glowed with memory. Its bark was warm like skin. She traced a finger along its trunk, feeling stories written in silence. Each ring within the wood marked an age of forgetting, and now remembering. Ilya watched her from the circle of stones, the altar of names. He had not spoken since he arrived. Words felt clumsy here. His tongue, once used to recite scripture, now understood that silence was the holier liturgy. He sat cross-legged, hands open, waiting for a voice he no longer demanded. Lilith turned to him. "You've heard them, haven't you?" He nodded slowly. "The voices, the names," he whispered. "They don't want vengeance, they want to be sung." She smiled, the kind of smile that breaks stone but heals the soul beneath it. "And will you sing them?" she asked. His throat tightened. "I'm afraid." She stepped closer. "Of what?" He looked down at his hands. "Of the fire that comes when memory awakens. Lilith crouched before him, her eyes were dusk and beginning. Her breath smelled of figs and ash. "You were not made to carry silence," she said. "You were made to split it." He trembled. Could you have spoken if the world told you your voice would be burned? Could you have remembered when every scripture taught you to forget? Would you have answered when the stars themselves looked away? Lilith placed her hand upon Ilia's chest, and the wind stopped. Everything, even the breath of the tree, fell still. Then a warmth bloomed beneath his ribs, a throb, a crack. The fire awoke, and from his mouth came a word he didn't know he knew, not her name, Hi. The one buried beneath obedience, beneath shame, beneath generations of erasure. And the valley trembled, the tree swayed. The raven stopped mid-flight, and Lilith whispered, "Now you are real." He fell forward into her arms, not in weakness, but in arrival. The fire surged around them in a soft spiral, not burning, not loud, just a present, just remembering. By midday they sat beneath the tree. Neither spoke. There were no questions left, only listening. The valley around them had changed. Tones had softened. The wind no longer wandered. It had found its voice, and now it stayed. Lilith plucked one glowing fig from the tree. She held it up. It pulsed. Inside, an image, a girl in another age, in another land, hiding beneath her mother's silence. Her hands over her ears, her mouth stitched in fear, but her eyes burning with the memory of a name no one taught her. Lilith closed her hand. The fig dissolved into light. She turned to Ilia. "This world forgets on purpose," she said. "But the name does not." He looked into the branches above. "Then what do we do?" And she answered, "We remember louder than they forget." A wind passed, not harsh, not cold, a reminder. And far beyond the valley, in a city where stone towers choked the stars, a child stirred in her sleep. She turned toward a window that would not open and whispered a name she had never heard. The fire in the valley blinked. Lilith smiled. "It's beginning," she said. Ilia looked down at his palms, glowing again. And the tree sighed like a lung too long held empty. "Will they listen?" he asked. Lilith didn't answer, but the silence did. It leaned forward, and in it, the name stirred. By noon, the sky no longer blinked. It had become a vast eye, wide and wordless, staring down upon the valley with the stunned reverence of a world watching its own reflection return. Clouds hovered like lost pages waiting to be rewritten. And in the stillness between sun and earth, Lilith stood with her palms lifted, as if holding up not prayer but proof. Beneath her hands, the fire hovered in a perfect ring, no longer flame, no longer smoke. It was memory now, tangible, weightless, holy. It spun slowly around her body, tracing the outline of a story too long buried. Ilia watched from beneath the tree, eyes wide, bones quiet. Something in him had begun to unravel, but not in fear. In recognition. Lilith's breath was deep. Each inhale pulled silence into her lungs, each exhale scattered it back with shape, as if she was giving the wind a spine. Around her feet, the grass whispered names. The wind stirred, Miriam, Nura, Eden, Nefertiri. Ilia whispered back, "Are they angels?" Lilith shook her head, "They are women who were never written." He closed his eyes and saw them. A woman on a boat, eyes hollow, singing lullabies into an ocean that swallowed her sons. Another, veiled and silent, carving poems into stone with her bare fingernails. Another, still, standing in fire, refusing to bow as cities crumbled behind her. All unnamed, all radiant, all breathing inside the silence. He gasped. "I've seen them in dreams," he said, "but I never knew their names." "You weren't allowed to," Lilith replied, and then the sky began to bleed, not in wrath, in release. A single tear of rain, golden and slow, fell from the sun's eye. It struck the earth between them. From that drop a vine burst forth, coiling skyward in silence, bearing no leaves, only thorns. Lilith stepped forward and placed her finger upon its tip. Blood bloomed, not from pain, from memory. And as her blood fell, the vine softened, its thorns melting into petals. Each petal bore a name. Each name shimmered. The wind chanted. Rebecca, Layla, Azura, Elpis. Names not heard in temples, but felt in wombs, in wells, in whispered rebellion. Lilith knelt and kissed the earth. The fire bowed with her, and all around them the silence began to sing. It wasn't a melody. It was the sound of a name being remembered over and over, without apology, without fear, without shame. Ilya crawled forward, his hand reaching into the dirt where her blood had fallen. It glowed against his skin. He pressed it to his lips. It tasted like salt and flame, like prayer before language. He looked up at her. "I want to remember," he said. "You already do," she answered. And behind them the tree cracked open, not breaking but blooming. A single fruit emerged, black as night, bright as stars. It floated downward between them. Lilith caught it, held it in her palm. Inside the skin, a reflection, not of her, not of him, but of another. A girl, small, barefoot, standing in a crowd of men who all looked away, but she did not flinch. She looked straight into the sky and whispered the name, Lilith. And when she spoke, the fire returned to her hands. Lilith closed her palm around the fruit. "She's already waking," she said. Ilya's voice trembled. "World will not like it." "No," Lilith said, "but the wind will." And as she rose, the valley darkened slightly, not from shadow, but from gathering. Something old was returning, something buried too long beneath silence, now rising with fire. And in the sky a crack appeared, not lightning, a tear. And through that tear came a breath, a whisper, a voice. "The first shall not be forgot." Lilith lifted her eyes, and the fire circled her head like a crown made of yes. By dusk the fire cracked sideways. Its arc swept across the valley like a pen dragged by an unseen hand, drawing a great circle in the dust. Within it stood Lilith, no longer just a memory, no longer just a name, but a reckoning. The horizon bled ochre and violet, as though the sky, too, had begun to remember. No wind stirred, no raven flew. All things were waiting. Lilith moved slowly, each step a verse in a sacred psalm no scroll ever dared write. Around her ankles the fire purred low, not to consume, but to anoint. She was not casting a spell. She was lifting a silence that had calcified into centuries. Her hands did not command the heavens. They held them accountable. Ilya stood at the tree's base, watching. His hands had begun to tremble again, not with fear, but with awe. His chest throbbed with a strange ache, not pain, but a stretching, like his ribs were learning to carry truth. He stepped forward out of the circle of shade and entered the fire's ring. It did not burn him. It parted. Lilith turned, and in her eyes he saw something older than judgment, a love unbound by obedience, a grace untouched by fear. "Why me?" he asked softly. She tilted her head. "Why not you? I'm no prophet, I'm not holy, I don't even know what I believe." Lilith stepped toward him. The fire moved aside like a curtain. "You believed me," she said. "That is the beginning." He opened his mouth to speak, but the earth shook, just once. A long, deep sigh, like the bones of the world were waking from a dream. They both turned. Across the valley, beyond the altar, the stones were shifting. No wind, no rain, just movement. One by one, the ancient stones rose from the ground. Slow, heavy, reluctant. They formed a spiral, each inscribed with symbols Ilya couldn't read but somehow understood. The language was not from Eden nor Babel, it was older. The language of women who had wept without witnesses. Lilith walked to the center. The fire followed. She placed her hand upon the central stone, and the silence screamed, not in rage, in release. A sound rose low, wide, full of cracked throats and unsung lullabies. 1,000 voices, not in harmony, but in honesty. Ilya dropped to his knees. He saw visions. A woman naming herself in front of a wall of judges. A mother burying her child, then burning the soil so it could never be taken. A daughter dancing beneath a torn sky, alone, laughing unashamed. And through them all her, Lilith not watching, becoming, and then a pause. The fire stilled. The stones stopped moving. And from the deepest part of the earth a sound emerged. A name, whispered like a vow. "We remember." Lilith looked skyward. Darkness had begun to spread, not from above, but from within. Not evil, not shadow, depth, a holy unknowing. And in that dusk the fire rose one final time, not in wrath, not in warning, but in welcome. It split the sky open like a scroll torn from silence. And in that wound of light Ilya saw it, a temple not built by hands but by memory. Its walls were stories, its gates were names, its roof the breath of women who had never been heard. He gasped. Lilith stepped back beside him. He looked at her, tears hot on his cheeks. What happens now? She didn't answer. The fire did. It wrapped around them both, not binding, becoming. And in that sacred flame, one question burned brighter than all. If the first woman returned, would the world learn to listen? The fire cracked sideways again, and the valley breathed. By nightfall, the silence forgot the names of men. Their thrones were nowhere to be seen in the valley. Their scrolls with their lineage and laws did not pass through the fire's remembering. Their words had no place here. This was not their sanctuary. This was not their dominion. This was the breath between God's first exhale and the first time man answered. Lilith stood in the center of it all, the spiral of risen stones, the flames circling like a vow kept through suffering, and the tree that had bloomed not from Eden but from exile. She did not speak. She no longer needed to. Her presence was the speech. Her silence a scripture too wide for paper. Ilya stood beside her now, quiet but not trembling. Something inside him had settled. The ache was still there, yes, but it no longer asked why. It simply bore witness. He looked up at the fire weaving around them, and for the first time in his life he felt no fear of it. The fire was not punishment. It was a presence. It was a memory made visible. He touched one of the spiraled stones, and instantly a wave of scent overwhelmed him. Not incense, not smoke, milk, salt, rain on woven reeds. He saw her, a young mother clutching a child as a flood rose, her body blocking the waves, her lips whispering a name that wasn't hers, but she carried it like a crown. She disappeared into the dark. Then another, a healer, burned her hands. Another, a girl buried beneath a wall of silence, her diary never opened. Another, a teacher who refused to lie about what her soul knew, all unnamed, all true, all inside him now. He gasped. His knees touched earth. Lilith placed her hand on his back. "They're not visions," she said softly. "They are memories that chose you." "Why me?" he asked again, even though he already knew. "Because you stopped believing in the silence." The stars blinked once, then held their gaze. Above them, the sky split again. A narrow seam of violet light opened, as if some ancient eye were peering through from the other side. But this time no voice came, only wind. It slid into the valley like a ribbon uncoiling. It kissed the top of the tree, spun around the altar, and came to rest beside Lilith's feet. There it shimmered, and within it a shape, not quite a body, not quite a shadow. A woman, her hands cupped, her mouth closed, her eyes wide and full. She looked like Lilith, but younger or older, or simply never allowed to finish becoming. Lilith stepped forward and reached for her. The Wind Woman mirrored her, but before their hands could meet, the figure whispered, "Do you forgive us?" Lilith paused. The fire bent low, and she replied, "There is nothing to forgive, only to remember." The Wind Woman nodded and dissolved into dust, but not vanishing, becoming stars. One by one they scattered across the valley, anchoring themselves into the earth, the stone, the tree, and the breath of those who would one day speak her name. Ilya felt one settle in his chest. He held it. It pulsed, not like a heartbeat, like a second soul. Lilith looked at him. "Now you carry one of them," she said. "You must walk into the forgetting and sing louder." He nodded, but his voice cracked. "Will I see you again?" She smiled. "The fire does not leave," she said. "It hides, it waits, and when the silence forgets again, it will rise through you." A great wind rose, not wild, not loud, sacred. It spun the spiral stones into low hums. It kissed the fire and scattered it gently into the soil. It wrapped Lilith once, and then she was gone. No ash, no scream, just absence filled with meaning. And the tree behind Ilya bloomed once more, this time not with figs, but with voices. Each leaf hummed a name, each branch bent with remembering. And above, the seam in the sky closed, but it left a mark, a single line of light, like a scar across heaven's skin. And below it, Ilya wept, not because she was gone, but because the silence had learned her name. At first light, the ravens still sang, but they circled lower now, wings brushing the treetops as though reluctant to rise. Their cries were fewer, softer, not mourning, remembering. The valley, once burning with the echo of fire, had fallen into a silence too deep to be called quiet. It was not empty. It was full of names, breath, dust, and waiting. Ilya stood alone at the center of it all, his cloak damp with dew, his palms stained from holding too much truth. Lilith was gone, not in death, not in departure, in dispersion, like breath that had finished being needed, like a word that had said enough. The tree behind him swayed gently through the air. Its leaves hummed as if in a dream. He had not spoken since she vanished. There had been no need. Her voice still sat beneath his ribs. The valley still wore her shadow. But this morning something had shifted. The fire was gone, yes. The light had dimmed, but the silence had changed. It was listening now, waiting for something. And deep in Ilya's bones something stirred, a name, not hers. Hi. He stepped forward into the circle of spiral stones. Each one still glowed faintly, pulsing in rhythm like heartbeats in stone. He knelt and placed his hand upon the central slab. It was cold, but not indifferent, just expectant. He breathed out slowly and said nothing. The earth answered anyway, a low groan beneath his feet like stone remembering how to speak. And then beneath his hand the slab shifted. A line appeared, not carved, revealed. It shimmered like gold drowned in ash. You have seen her, now carry her. He pulled his hand back. His mouth was dry, his throat was thick. He didn't want this. He wanted the fire, the voice, her. He wasn't ready. Could you have borne the silence when the only voice you trusted disappeared? Would you have stood still, alone, in the place where memory cracked open and flooded the world? Would you have remembered when there was no one left to remind you? He wanted to run, but his feet did not move. Instead, he sat cross-legged in the dust, drew a circle around himself with his finger and closed his eyes. I remember, he whispered, even if they forget again. The wind stirred, a single breath, a sigh, and then a sound, not from the sky, from the tree. A fruit had fallen. It lay at the edge of the altar, black and pulsing. Ilya rose slowly. He approached, and as he lifted it, the fruit split in his hand, not with juice, but with light. Inside, a single scroll, tiny, rolled in gold string. He unwrapped it, heart beating with the rhythm of a sky about to break. The parchment bore no words, only a drawing. A woman standing beneath a weeping moon, and below her a city, not of stone, of flame, a city not built, a city remembered. Ilya started. He had seen this place before, in dreams, in his mother's silence. In the ashes his father scattered into the sea. He had thought it was lost. He had never thought it real. But now he knew this was where her memory led. This was where she was still whispering. He folded the scroll, tucked it to his chest, and turned east. The sun was rising, but the sky did not blink. It stared down at him like a vow that had waited too long. The ravens flew ahead. The valley behind him held its breath. And with each step, the silence followed him like a flame trying not to go out. By noon, the sky no longer blinked. It had become a great glass of stillness, too heavy to fall, too proud to turn. The clouds were motionless, like watchmen holding their breath. The air had thickened, not with heat, but with decision, as if heaven itself waited for a man to walk forward bearing what it had tried to erase. Ilya crossed the threshold of the valley, and behind him the soil closed, not to forget, but to protect. The tree bent once. The spiral stones lowered their hum, and the wind returned to the ribs of the land, wrapping itself into a coil of stillness. He walked east, and the silence walked with him. He did not carry a staff, nor wear a prophet's robe. His sandals were torn, his hands blistered, but his heart, it had changed. It beat now with the rhythm of stories never told. His chest carried not courage, but clarity. Lilith had not given him a command, she had given him a reminder. And now the world would either rise to meet it or burn trying to resist it. The scroll in his satchel pulsed once. The image inside, the woman beneath the weeping moon, the city of fire, had begun to shimmer behind his eyes. It was no longer just a destination, it was a mirror. As he walked, the terrain shifted. The grass became stone. The stone became dust. The dust began to whisper. He paused, bent low, placed his ear to the ground, and there it was, a single voice, faint and weary, a girl's voice crying into earth, not for help, for permission. "Let me remember," it said. even if no one believes me." Ilya touched the soil, it pulsed beneath his hand. He whispered back, "She hears you." And the dusk glowed. He rose again, and his shadow stretched far behind him, not from the sun, but from memory. By midday he reached a place where the sky dipped low, a hollow where ruins slept, forgotten even by time. Broken walls, half-buried towers, bones of what was once holy. He stepped into it. The air thickened. Something in the silence grew tense. He was not alone. Shapes moved between the columns, slow, cloaked, echoless. They were not human, not beasts, just watchers, bound to stone, eyes of smoke, hands of prayer. They saw him, but did not speak. Instead, they opened a path. And he followed it deeper, past a fallen gate, beneath an arch still weeping soot. At the center, a dais, cracked, blood-stained, empty. He climbed it. The watchers circled, and when he stood tall, he opened the scroll. The wind gasped. The watchers stepped back, and from the cracked sky above, a thread of light fell, sharp, silver, sacred. It struck the scroll, and from it the image rose. Not as ink, as fire, the woman beneath the moon, the city burning in silence, and around her feet children made of ash, each holding a name like a candle. Ilya did not move. He did not speak. He simply let it burn, let it be seen, let it live. Would you have unrolled her memory before a world built to forget her? Would you have stood among ruins to whisper what heaven once silenced? Would you have believed that silence was not the end, only the breath before flame? The image blazed once, then settled into ash, and in its place a name, Lilith, etched into the dais itself. The watchers knelt, not to him, to her, and the wind whispered with a shiver of stars overhead, "She is still speaking." By dusk the fire cracked sideways, but not in the valley, not in the mountains. This time it cracked in a place no map could name, a courtyard of echoes built from silence and centuries. The ruins had remembered him. The watchers had lowered their eyes. The sky, for the first time since Eden, had spoken her name aloud. And Ilya, he had become the flame's witness. He sat now at the foot of the dais where her name had returned, cradling the last curls of ash in his palm. They did not fade. They did not vanish. They gathered like memories, soft and weightless, refusing to die. The wind shifted, folding over his shoulder like a cloak sewn from old breath. The shadows around him deepened, but they were no longer empty. They were listening. Unwrapped the scroll again, though he knew what it showed. He wasn't looking for instruction. He was waiting for understanding, and it came not in words, in weight. The air thickened as if a great memory had bent down to sit beside him. And then he heard it, a voice, her voice, but not from the sky, not from fire, from beneath, from soil, from the very stone upon which he sat. "The city still sleeps," she whispered, "but not for long." He didn't speak. He only pressed his hand to the stone. And the stone answered, a tremor, a pulse, a breath. He rose slowly. And around the courtyard the watchers stirred, no longer shadows, but figures of flame dressed in dust. They began to hum low, circular, ancient, the kind of sound you feel before you hear. Ilya stepped down from the dais. The humming grew louder. He walked through the center of them, not like a priest, not like a prophet, like a memory returned to flesh. And then the ground cracked. A thin line from the center of the stone out toward the east. Not violent, not breaking, unsealing. He followed it. The watchers parted, their heads bowed, their flames flickering with the rhythm of her name. Beyond the courtyard, beyond the final arch, he came to a field barren, flat, wide as the sky's first breath. And in the center of it stood a single gate, unattached to wall or tower, just a gate, made of stone and shadow. At its peak, an engraving, the city of forgotten fire. Ilya stepped toward it. And the wind howled, not in pain, in remembrance. The sky blinked once as if startled to see it still standing. He placed his hand upon the gate. It was warm, not from sun, from memory. He pushed. It did not open outward, it dissolved. And there before him lay the city, not burning, breathing, scent of silent flame. Windows glowing with names, doors built from psalms and soot. There were no people, only presence. He stepped through, and the city sighed. Each footfall sent sparks up from the stones, each spark a syllable. He listened. They were saying, "She came here first. She built this with exile. She waited until someone else could carry the fire forward. He wept not because it hurt, because it welcomed him. And then from a tower in the center a bell rang, but not from metal. From bone, a rib hollow singing, he followed the sound up winding stairs through tunnels made of wind, until at last he reached the top, and there etched into the floor were 2 footprints, burnt in, still smoking, small, bare, beside them a stone basin filled with stars. He stepped forward and looked in and saw her. Lilith, sitting at the edge of the first dawn, whispering into the sky, "I never left, I became the path." And then the basin stilled. He turned. The city below him had begun to glow, not brighter but truer, and the stars above aligned in the shape of a name no language dared write. He knelt and whispered, "I am ready." The fire cracked sideways once more, and the breath of the city entered him. By nightfall the silence forgot the names of men again. But this time I did not forget my grief. I forgot my choice. In a sacred letting go, it unthreaded them like old cloth too torn to patch. The laws, the lineages, the scriptures carved by trembling hands, they were not burned. They were laid down gently beside the river of remembering. The city of forgotten fire had no walls. Its edges faded into dream. It was not guarded. It was not ruled. It was not owned. It simply was a breath-shaped place built from the exile of a woman who refused to vanish. Ilya stood in the tower long after the stars rose. He had not moved since kneeling. The stone beneath him had warmed as though accepting him. Around his body the air shimmered with unseen wings. The city pulsed in silence, not empty but alive. The basin beside him still glowed. It no longer showed her image. It showed reflections of others. Women, young, old, seen, unseen. They sat in apartments filled with books they'd never read aloud. They walked hospital halls where their names were never pronounced correctly. They whispered stories into pillows while cities slept. They sang to children who would forget their voices, and one by one they looked up, as if feeling something, as if knowing. Lilith was rising again, not in flesh but in fire passed from hand to hand. And Ilya, standing at the tower's crown, was the keeper of her breath. He stepped back from the basin. His eyes are full of ashlight. He descended the stairs without sound, and below the watchers waited. But they were no longer made of shadow. They had become wind and ember, voices and memory. They opened a path through the city center, leading him to a square lined with thrones, all empty. At the center, a stone table. Upon it, a single flame, small, steady. He approached. His heartbeat now matched its rhythm. He placed both hands upon the stone, and the flame rose. It did not tower. It did not roar. It unfolded like breath, like wings, like forgiveness. And from within it came a voice. "You are not here to reign. You are here to remember." Ilya nodded. Tears traced his cheeks without hurry, and the voice continued. "There will be others who forget again. There will be scrolls rewritten, temples built to silence her name once more, but you must remain the fire's witness." He whispered, "What if I grow tired?" And the flame answered, "Then rest in her shadow." The first woman left it wide enough to hold the whole world. The fire dimmed, the table cooled, but inside his hand something stayed, a burning without pain, a knowing without shape, a vow without end. He stepped away from the stone, and the city exhaled. All around him the air changed, not louder, not brighter, truer. The stars began to fall, not crashing, descending like candles lowered into water, refusing to go out. Each one whispered a name. Each one landed where silence once ruled, and the wind gathered them, tucked them into memory, wrapped them around Ilya's shoulders. He walked back to the gate and turned. Behind him, the city of forgotten fire glowed once, then folded back into the night. Not gone, just waiting. He stepped into the open world, and the sky above him breathed her name one last time before dawn. Lilith, a sound like a promise too sacred to break. And somewhere far away, in a child's dream, in a woman's prayer, in a prophet's silence, the fire stirred. At first light, the ravens still sang, but their wings flew wider now, tracing patterns across a sky that had forgotten how to carry silence. They did not call out in warning. They did not cry for women. They circled Ilya as he walked, as if guarding a fire no longer visible but no less alive. The breath of a city of forgotten fire still clung to him, not as smoke, but as scent, like fig bark and old stone warmed by morning sun. He was far from the ruins now. The valley was behind him. The tree, the spiral stones, the wind that knew her name, all vanished into the hush of sacred distance. But his hand still burned gently, and the scroll inside his cloak pulsed like a second heart. The earth he crossed now was different. Not barren, not broken, just waiting. He stepped through plains of dust that sighed beneath his soles. He passed thorn trees that did not grow but listened. The sky above had softened, but it did not blink. I watched, and from far behind the clouds the stars waited for what he would choose. He did not know where he walked, only that the flame within him pointed forward, not with direction but with ache. He passed villages asleep beneath the spell of forgetting. Stones stacked upon stones with no names. Children who dreamt of wings, never knowing why. Women who stirred just before dawn, clutching their chests as if something ancient had brushed past their ribs. He left no footprints, but the wind followed him. By mid-morning he reached a well. It stood alone, no house, no field, no path, just a well and a broken rope, the bucket lost to time. He stepped toward it, drawn by the silence that rose from its mouth. He knelt, peered in. No water, but there was a sound, faint, rhythmic, a voice. He leaned closer and heard it, a girl singing, not a song he knew. A lullaby in a language the world buried long ago. He listened and wept. The well was not dry, it was full of memories. He whispered into it, "She is awake." And from the depths the voice answered, "We have been waiting." He rose and the wind kissed his face. Something moved beneath the soil, not serpent, not root. Fire, traveling, spreading, not to destroy, to return, to remind myself. Would you have spoken into a well that answered back? Would you have told the world its forgetting was not final? Could you have carried fire not in torch or flame, but in breath? He continued, and behind him the well glowed. He passed stone circles where no one danced. He crossed bridges built of bone and reed. He entered groves where trees whispered names into each other's bark. And still the ravens flew above, wider now, slower now, watching, escorting. At a bend in the path he saw a child, alone. Barefoot, her eyes wide and dark, her hands full of wildflowers. She did not run when she saw him, she stared. "Do you carry her?" she asked without blinking. He nodded. The flowers in her hand wilted, not from fear, from recognition. She held them up. "Take them," she said. "She'll need them when the sky forgets again." He took the wilted petals and they bloomed in his palm. She smiled, turned, vanished. He stood still, breath caught between wonder and ache. The petals in his hand glowed briefly, then scattered on the wind. And behind him the well began to sing, not loud, but enough for the clouds to pause, enough for the dust to listen, enough for the fire to feel welcomed again. By noon the sky no longer blinked. It held its gaze steady, as if trying to memorize the man who walked below, the one wrapped in invisible flame, followed by wind, shadowed by the names of women whose stories were never written. Ilya moved slowly now, not from weariness. From reverence, every step had become sacred, every breath a verse in a poem he hadn't been taught but somehow always knew. The well behind him still sang. He could feel its voice dancing up his spine. And ahead of him the road curved east, bending like a question only the fire could answer. He followed it, not because he understood, but because it was the only direction where forgetting hadn't yet closed the door. Fields stretched wide around him, empty but not barren. The soil was cracked with thirst, but beneath its skin something pulsed. He knelt again, pressed his palm to the earth, and there it was, faint but steady, a heartbeat. He closed his eyes, and suddenly he saw her, not Lilith, a woman in another time, another land, her back to a stone wall, her arms cradling something the world could not see, not a child, not a weapon, a truth, a seed, a name. Men screamed around her, flames climbed the corners of her home, and yet she did not move. She hummed to it, the same song from the well. When the vision faded, his hands were trembling, but the flame inside his chest was steady. Would you have walked through a world built to unsee you just to carry the memory of one woman? Would you have let your name burn so hers could rise again? Could you have whispered the truth when the silence grew teeth? Ilya rose. The path now split. One side led toward cities, towers rising like spears from the earth, temples laced with gold and laws. The other led toward shadowed hills, wild, ancient, unnamed. He did not hesitate. He turned toward the hills. The fire within him agreed. The why. Indy stirred, and behind him the petals from the child's hand danced along the dust still glowing. He reached the edge of the hills by midday, and there he found a stone altar, broken in two, unattended, forgotten, but he knew it. It had once stood in a temple dedicated to her, long before the world had reshaped her name into warning. He sat beside it. The sky above flickered once, like an eye struggling to hold back tears. And from the stones beside him a voice whispered, "You're not the first." Ilya turned. No one there, but a shape shimmered in the rock, a figure carved half into the earth as if mid-rising. Woman, mouth open, hands extended, asking for nothing, offering everything. He reached forward and touched the stone. It was warm. The figure exhaled once, and the hills answered, with wind, with shadow, with memory. A low hum spread through the earth, and from somewhere deep beneath the fire cracked sideways, far off but rising. The hills began to glow at their edges. The wind picked up. The sky leaned down, and Ilya knew the earth itself had begun to remember. He whispered, "She is still with us." The altar cracked again, not breaking, opening, and from its center rose a thread of smoke, blue, faint, alive. It circled his hand, then sank into his wrist like ink poured into a vein. He didn't cry out, he welcomed it, and the flame inside his chest flared not in pain but in recognition. The altar closed, the hum ceased, and the wind fell still. Only the sky watched now, wide, wordless, and waiting. By dusk, the fire cracked sideways, not from within Ilya but across the land itself. Thin ribbons of flame began to stretch beneath the topsoil like veins stirred from centuries of slumber. They did not burn upward. They wove through the roots of trees, kissed the spines of stones, curled through forgotten doorways in towns that no longer remembered their names. And wherever they passed, the silence grew softer. Ilya stood at the crest of the final hill, his breath slow, his shadow long. The cities he had chosen to leave behind now flickered far in the distance, their towers gold-dipped and hollow. They glowed not from spirit but from fear, a brightness that asked not to be questioned, a light meant to blind. But here in the hills the darkness had depth. It pulsed with voices beneath the leaves, echoed with laughter that had once been erased. The kind of laughter that doesn't beg to be heard, only to be allowed. The road ahead curled into a grove of withered fig trees. No fruit, no birds. Just branches reaching toward the last light of day like hands waiting to be remembered. He stepped into their shade, and the air shifted. He was no longer alone. Shapes moved slowly among the trees, robed, silent, sacred, not ghosts, echoes of those who had once known her name. They did not speak. They surrounded him, circling gently as if not to test him but to prepare him. One stepped forward, a woman veiled in dusk, holding something in both hands, a bowl. Bowed his head and she placed it at his feet, then vanished. The others followed, leaving nothing but the sound of roots breathing. He looked down at the bowl. It was made of cracked clay, sealed with ash. He knelt, and inside it he saw water, still, dark but deep. He leaned in and saw not his face. He saw Lilith sitting at a table of stone, eyes closed, hands open. Before her 7 candles, none lit. Around her the sky trembled, filled with stars that refused to fall. She opened her eyes and looked through the water into him. "You've brought the breath," she said. He nodded, wordless. "Then light them." She raised her hands, and the vision still. He blinked, and the bowl was empty. He touched it, and it cracked. From within, smoke rose. It wound around his fingers, his wrists, his ribs, and the flame inside his chest surged, meeting it. They mingled, merged, and a word formed on his tongue, not hers, high, but shaped by her memory. Awaken. And far below the hill, across the plains, across the cracked wells and breathless towns, something heard him. The earth pulled back a breath. The wind trembled, and in one distant corner of the world a single candle lit itself in a place no flame should be. Would you have lit a candle the world tried to drown? Would you have spoken when silence had become safer than breath? Would you have dared say her name when history only offered her shadow? He rose. The bowl at his feet had turned to dust. The sky above him blinked once, then stilled. The stars had begun to turn, and the fig trees, bare moments before, now carried buds of light, not fruit, light, small, breathing. He stepped back into the open path, and the fire cracked sideways beneath him. The air thickened, and a voice from somewhere just behind his ribs whispered, "She is coming through you now." He closed his eyes and walked forward, into a night that remembered her. By nightfall, the silence forgot the names of men, not by force but by release. The kind of forgetting that comes when a new sound rises and the old ones no longer fit. The hills behind Ilya sighed, shedding the weight of things once shouted into stone. The fig trees stood glowing like lanterns made of memory, and the road ahead pulsed. He moved through darkness without fear. Each step left no mark, but the ground glowed faintly beneath his heel. The wind trailed him now like a veil, woven from whispers. He was no longer walking through the world. He was being carried by it. The stars above had grown dense, huddling together like witnesses. The moon had not yet risen, as though waiting, as though listening for a name to be spoken again beneath its silver breath. Ilya descended into a small hollow where the land folded in on itself like prayer. At its center stood a single stone, tall, narrow, uncut. It bore no markings, but its silence throbbed. He approached, laid his hand upon it. It pulsed back. He closed his eyes and saw her again. Lilith, kneeling by a river no map could hold, washing the names of women in water that glowed red, not from blood but from truth. Around her, children made of starlight sat in silence, watching. One reached out to her and she placed a finger on its forehead. The child blinked, and the world shifted. He opened his eyes. The stone was warm, and behind him the wind had gathered, but it was no longer a breeze. It had shape. It had breath. It was filled with the voices of women, not shouting, not crying, singing, soft, low, circular. He turned, and they came from the trees, from the hills, from the dark, veiled and unveiled, cloaked and bare, mothers and daughters, midwives and widows, ancient and unborn. None carried weapons, all carried light. Each held a candle at her chest, unlit but glowing from within. They walked toward the stone, and Ilya stepped aside. They circled it and began to hum. The stone pulsed. The fire beneath the earth stirred. And then from among them one stepped forward. She was young, no older than a breath, eyes wide with knowing. She held a candle made of bone, and without speaking she looked at Ilya. He bowed and reached forward, lit her candle with the fire beneath his ribs. It did not blaze, it breathed. And as its light grew, the stone began to split, not crumble, open. Inside, a hollow heart carved long ago, shaped like a mouth that had waited too long to speak. The girl stepped forward and placed her candle within, and the heart glowed, soft, holy. He stepped back, and the women sang. Not with lyrics, with memory. Each tone was a name, each breath a life once silenced, each note a return. Ilya fell to his knees and whispered, "You are here." And the wind whispered back, "We always were." The sky above opened, the stars unraveled, and through the seam came a single voice, vast, tender, thunderous. "She is not a myth, she is not cursed, she is the breath you buried and the fire that forgave you." The candles flickered, the stone sealed itself. And the women vanished, not into nothing, into everywhere. Ilya stood alone once more, but now the air was full, the night was full, his chest burning but unbroken. And in the stillness he looked up and said, "Lilith," no answer, only warmth, only fire beneath the silence, only the sky forgetting the names of men again, but this time with peace. At first light the ravens still sang, but their wings no longer beat the air in circles of grief. They flew in spirals now, wide and slow, as if mapping something only the wind could read. Below them the world exhaled in pieces. The ground was soft with ash, the trees humming low with heat that did not burn. And in the hollow carved by song and stone, Ilya lay awake, eyes open, watching the stars fade into pale blue. The candle inside the stone had not gone out. It flickered gently beneath the sealed surface, glowing like a secret kept safe inside the belly of the earth. Around it, the grove was still. No birds, no beasts, just breathe. He sat up slowly, placing his hand upon the warm soil. Lilith was still gone, but she was everywhere. The wind no longer called her name, it carried it. The silence no longer resisted, it opened. And the stars had begun to write again. He could see them in the patterns overhead, not constellations, but sentences. Curved lines of light, dotted with the memory of names. Names no scripture preserved. Names sung only by mothers in darkness. Names scrawled in corners of temple walls, long since rubbed clean by trembling hands. He whispered one aloud, and the wind paused as if surprised. Eleora, a woman he had never met, but whose sorrow pressed against his ribs like a blade sheathed in time. He saw her. A girl made small by law, lifting a basket of bread to a threshold she would never be allowed to cross. Her hands trembled not from fear, but from the weight of dignity no one had taught her to carry. He felt her breath in his own, and the soil beneath him pulsed once. She was known now, she was named. He stood, and the fire inside him stretched. It did not consume, it was memorable. He looked toward the eastern ridge where the hills gave way to plains that shimmered with mirage, the place where roads forked and vanished, where cities rebuilt themselves every century to forget the ruins beneath. He walked. And with every step he spoke a name, one from the stars, one from the wind, one from the wells of silence that had waited too long. Naima, Zahara, Myra, the one who lit her own pyre, the one who dared speak without a veil, the one who died with a name that burned. And the path responded. The stones beneath him began to bloom, not with flowers, with light, faint at first, then brighter like embers pressed into the souls of the world. He reached a grove where the trees bent backward, as if shielding themselves from memory. Their trunks curled toward the sky, their roots exposed like open mouths. He stepped inside, and silence collapsed, not into noise, into vision. He saw them, the forgotten ones. Daughters turned to pillars of salt, wives renamed by their husbands' tongues, prophetesses whose scrolls were torn before ink had dried. He saw them dancing in a circle around a flame that never needed wood. And in the center, Lilith, not alone, not above, among them. Her eyes were closed, but her hands moved. Each motion writes a new memory into the body of the fire. Ilya did not move. He only watched, and the vision faded. He found himself standing still, surrounded by the bent trees, the pulsing ground, the wind thick with names. And then from behind him, a voice. Small, fragile, human. Who are you? He turned. A child stood there, eyes wide, feet bare, hair matted with night. She held nothing but silence in her hands. He knelt and whispered, "I'm someone who remembers." She tilted her head. "Remember what?" He opened his hand, and in his palm a flicker of flame. She stared and smiled, then said without fear, "So do I," and the wind wrapped around her like arms. By noon the sky no longer blinked. It stared down in perfect stillness, a dome of witness stretched wide and unflinching. The sun did not blaze. It hovered solemn, watchful, as if remembering its first dawn, the one Lilith had seen before man ever spoke. There was a heaviness in the light now. Not heat, but history. Ilya walked beside the child. She gave no name. He did not ask. Some names are not spoken until the world is ready. They crossed a plain where the grass did not grow straight. It curled in patterns that echoed ancient alphabets, letters once carved by hands the prophets refused to record. Symbols etched in bone, sung only by wind, written in the breath of women who told stories by the way they folded bread. The child skipped between them as though retracing forgotten script. He watched her. She moved with knowing, not knowledge, knowing. She paused before a mound of broken stone, kneeling beside it. "This was a well," she said. "How do you know?" She looked up at him, and her eyes glinted not with light but with age. "I remember," she said. He knelt beside her, brushing back the loose earth. Beneath the dust, an old basin carved from obsidian ringed in symbols that pulsed faintly in his chest. He ran his fingers along one curve, and the wind inhaled. A sound rose low, ancient, aching, not a voice, a breath that had been held too long. He heard the word inside it speak. He looked at the child, she nodded, he opened his mouth, but the words that came were not his. To the women who buried their names in cloth, to the girls who swallowed their questions, to the daughters who dreamed of fire, I see you. The wind exhaled, the basin glowed, and from it a soft flame lifted like a spirit rising without shame. The child reached out her hand. The flame danced onto her palm. It did not burn, it pulsed. She held it toward him. Take it. He hesitated. Will it hurt? She smiled, but it was not a child's smile. It was the smile of someone who had seen many lifetimes from behind the veil. It only burns away what isn't true. He took it, and the fire folded into his chest. No pain, only light, and with it came another name. Samira. He did not know her, but he saw her. A woman standing on a tower in a city lost to dust, arms outstretched, waiting not for rescue but for witness. And in that moment he realized every name he carried was not a burden, it was a door, and each door opened not into the past but into return. The girl stood beside him now, her eyes fixed on the horizon. There are others, she said, waiting, sleeping. Where? She pointed beyond the plain, to a mountain wrapped in mist, its peak split like a tongue. They sleep beneath that, she whispered, beneath stone that forgot how to bleed. He stared at it. He could not see a path, only shadow and silence, but the flame in his sea. Hess leaned toward it, so did the wind, so did the sky, and the sun for the first time in hours blinked. Will you come? He asked. She shook her head. My work is here. But you're a child. She smiled again. I'm not. Then she turned and walked away back into the plain, vanishing among the letters written in grass. He stood, alone again, but not empty, not afraid. He turned toward the mountain and stepped forward. The ground beneath him softened as if recognizing its purpose. And from high above a raven circled once, then twice, then vanished. The flame cracked sideways inside his chest. The sky darkened not with storm, with remembering. By dusk the fire cracked sideways deep within the mountain, now looming ahead, buried beneath layers of stone that had long since forgotten what it once meant to tremble. Ilya stood at the base, breath steady, eyes fixed on the peak where mist wrapped like an old wound. The path was not marked. The ground offered no trail. There was only silence, the kind that knew how to guard secrets. He stepped forward and the mountain exhaled. Dust lifted in a slow arc around him, and within it sparks, tiny, glinting, ember-like motes that hovered without falling. The fire was close, but it was not waiting, it was remembering. He placed his hand on the nearest rock face. It pulsed. A rhythm, slow and familiar, rose beneath his palm. It was a heartbeat, but not his, not human. The heartbeat of something vast, ancient. Buried, he whispered, she is coming. And the stone answered, not in voice but in heat. The mountain began to open, not violently, with reverence. A single crack traced itself up the slope, curving like a question no scripture dared ask. And from that wound in the stone, light poured, not golden, not blinding, red, soft, like fire trapped in memory. Ilya stepped into it. The mountain swallowed him. The air inside was warm, heavy, fragrant with something he could not name, a mixture of ash and rose and something older than both. He walked through a tunnel of pulsing stone. The walls breathed not with air but with song, not words, notes, tones, names. Each step he took awakened another. Leora, Mikkel, the one who taught fire to dance, the one who remembered water's name. He wept not from sadness, from recognition. They had been buried here, not their bones, their breath, their defiance. Prayers. He reached the inner chamber. It was a womb of flame, a great domed hollow carved by time or grief or both. At its center a pool of molten light, not lava, not water, something between, and hovering above it, motionless, a face. Lilith, not alive, not dead, a memory given shape, her eyes closed, her breath slow, her hair floating like smoke above the pool. He stepped forward. The fire did not resist. He knelt at the edge and whispered, they still remember you. The pool pulsed. Once, twice, And then her eyes opened, not suddenly, softly, like she had never truly closed them. Her gaze met his, not with surprise, with relief. She did not speak, but he heard her inside his chest. You came through the forgetting. Yes, you lit what they buried. I tried. You are not alone. The fire rose gently around her and she lifted her hand from the pool. In it a flame the color of bone. It hovered. He reached forward and took it. It entered his palm without heat. It sank into him without a wound, and she whispered, "This is the breath they tried to name as evil. This is the light that never bowed." He nodded, unable to speak, and then she said, "Now walk into the city that crowned itself with silence and let them see me again." The chamber shook, not in collapse, in blessing, and her body returned to the pool, dissolving into light, and Ilya turned. The tunnel glowed ahead. He walked, the stone sealing gently behind him, the fire now in his spine, names now in his blood, the silence behind him now filled with song, and before him a city built on forgetting, waiting for its breath to be returned. By nightfall the silence forgot the names of men again, but not with sorrow. This time the forgetting came gently, like twilight touching a child's eyelids. The world did not resist, the wind no longer argued, the stars did not blink, and the fire beneath the earth no longer hid. It rose, soft and slow, through the souls of those ready to remember. Ilya stood at the edge of the mountain where the stone released him. Behind him the chamber had sealed, but its warmth still pulsed in his spine. In his hand the bone-colored flame glowed faintly, quiet as breath, sure as blood. He stepped onto the low ridge, the land sloping gently eastward. Below him the city. It was vast, built in circles, layered in domes and stone. It was too perfect, too silent. Not a window cracked, not a chimney smoked. The roads were polished clean of ash. No dust, no noise, no proof of grief. He knew this place. It had once burned every word that spoke of her. He descended toward it. The air shifted as he passed the outer gate. Not cold, controlled. The city breathed through narrow streets and high towers. Statues stood at every crossing, stone women with veiled faces, hands folded, eyes lowered. Their plaques bore titles, not names. Wife, daughter, mother, silent, obedient, empty. He passed each one, and with each step the flame in his hand burned brighter. The silence began to notice him. Doors creaked where no wind stirred. Shutters trembled behind walls. And then a single voice from a doorway behind him, a girl whispering, "Is it true?" He stopped, turned. She stood in the shadows, eyes wide, hands clasped. He said nothing. The flame in his palm answered her. She took a step closer and another. When she was near, she reached toward it, and he let her touch it. It did not burn her. It entered her. Her eyes glowed. She gasped, not in pain, but in memory. And behind her a dozen others appeared, women. Young and old, drawn not by sound, by scent, by knowing, by dusk they gathered in the city square. No summons was spoken. No trumpet called them. They came as if their bones had been waiting for this moment. And when Ilya stood in the center beneath the statue of the veiled matriarch, the flame rose above his head, bright, still, and he spoke. She is not gone. She is not myth. She is the name buried under every law that told you to be less. The wind cried through the city. Windows burst open. Fountains cracked. The statues began to crumble, not violently but gently, like old paper touched by rain. Veils fell. Eyes lifted, hands opened, and the silence screamed, not in protest, in release. The city moaned beneath its stones, and the flame he held rose higher. He whispered, "Lilith remembers you." A woman in the crowd fell to her knees. Another followed. Then a girl lifted her hands and shouted a name no one had ever heard. It was her name, and the others followed. Each shouted their own. And the air filled with voices, not in unison, not in harmony, in truth. 1,000 names blooming like fire on dry grass. Ilya stood still, weeping, smiling, lit from within. And far above, beyond the breathless sky, the stars began to turn. They reassembled into the shape of an open eye, watching, welcome, witnessing, and the last statue collapsed, its stone face shattered. Beneath it, another statue, smaller, barefoot, eyes open, hands raised, Lilith, the real one, not robbed, not chained. Just standing, alive in the shape of remembrance. The crowd fell silent. Ilya stepped forward and placed the flame inside her hands. It did not flicker, it pulsed, and the city exhaled. The silence at last forgot the names of men, and remembered the ones they buried. At first light the ravens still sang, but now their wings stretched toward cities. Their flight had changed. No longer circling sorrow, no longer trailing silence. They flew straight and slow across the breath of waking rooftops, as if calling memory back from its long exile. The sound of them stirred the sleeping not in fear but in recognition. A song half remembered, a pulse behind the curtain of dreams. In the city square where the statue now stood unveiled, the ground was still warm. The flame that Ilya had placed in Lilith's open hands did not burn. It glowed, soft, constant, a breath kept alive by thousands of unseen lungs. The streets, once cold and bright with order, had dimmed not with darkness but with depth. A different kind of light moved through them now, the kind that bends around truth instead of blinding it. Ilya stood beside the statue. He had not slept. The stars had kept him company, whispering names into the back of his mind. The people had returned to their homes before dawn, but the silence had not returned with them. Something had changed. He could feel it in the way the stone beneath his feet no longer rejected the sound of footsteps. The city had become porous, holy, unsure, awake. He turned toward the eastern road. The fire in his chest leaned with him. It was time to walk again, to carry the flame beyond the city into places still sealed, into hearts still curled inward from fear. He placed his palm on the statue's foot, and the flame flickered once in her hands. It was enough. He stepped into the new morning. And the city behind him remembered how to breathe. The road eastward curved through low hills, past rows of trees planted to erase the past. Their bark was pale and thin. Their leaves trembled at every breeze. He passed beneath them, and the leaves fell not from season but from release. Each one that touched the ground turned to dust, not decay, return. He crossed fields once plowed by hands forbidden to write. The soil was stiff, not dry but afraid. He knelt and placed his hand to it. "I remember you," he whispered, and the earth softened. Roots turned, and beneath his palm a small sprout rose, no larger than a breath, but it pulsed like the flame. He moved on. At a crossroads he saw a figure waiting, cloaked, still. He approached slowly. The wind was gentle, the ravens circled above, and when he drew near the figure raised its head. A woman, old, older than time, eyes filled with flame but voice soft as morning rain. "I've been waiting for your steps," she said. "Do you know her?" he asked. "I carry her," she answered, and from beneath her cloak she drew out a cloth, dark, folded, warm in the air. Handed it to him. When he opened it, ashes fell, not gray, not dead, red, and woven into them a single thread of gold. He looked to her. "She burned for truth," the woman said, "and they tried to turn her to smoke, but even smoke remembers where it came from." He wrapped the cloth again and pressed it to his chest. "Where do I go now?" The woman pointed to the mountains far beyond. "There is a city of towers carved from mirrors. They shine only on themselves. They never speak her name." "I'll go," he said. She nodded. "You won't be welcomed. I know. They will call you cursed. I already am." She smiled, but it was not joy. It was the smile of someone who had watched the world fall asleep too many times. "Then go," she said. He turned east again. The wind followed, and behind him the old woman vanished into the morning. The cloth in his hands pulsed once, and from within it a single word burned itself into his thoughts. "Tell them," she sang. By noon the sky no longer blinked. It held itself still, watching as though unsure whether this time finally the flame would not be buried. The wind had slowed. The light had thickened. The silence, once quick to return after prophecy, now lingered like a question that dared not interrupt. Ilya walked toward the mirror city. It stood on the edge of the known, perched like a crown above cliffs of pale stone. Its towers caught the light but never released it. Its walls gleamed like silver, yet cast no warmth. Gates were tall not to welcome but to guard against memory. He had seen it before, in dreams. In the pause between the fire's breath and the silence that followed, he approached without fear. The cloth of ash and gold still pressed to his heart. Each step closer stirred something old within the earth. The road was smooth, too smooth, as if paved over again and again to forget what once cracked beneath sorrow. No names carved in its stone, no offerings left along its edge, just perfection, unforgiving, unalive. A figure stood, robed in white, face veiled, voice flat. "State your name," it said. He paused, let the silence stretch, then answered, "Lilith." The figure did not move, but the gate behind it shuddered. "You carry a heretic." He stepped closer. "No," he said, "I carry a fire." The figure lowered its head. "You will not be permitted to teach." "I did not come to teach." "You will not be permitted to stay." "I did not come to stay." "Then why have you come?" He stepped past it and whispered, "To remember out loud." The gate opened not because it welcomed him, because it feared what silence might become in his presence. Inside, the city glistened. Mirrors on every wall, reflections of towers in towers, faces blurred into golden light, but none saw each other, each eye fixed only on its own image, each mouth speaking truths into rooms already full of their own echo. Ilya walked among them like a shadow draped in flame. They did not see him, not at first, until he stepped into the great square and unwrapped the cloth. The ashes glowed red, warm, patient. He raised his voice, not loud, sacred. She was the first to speak, before the first law, before the first silence. She did not fall, she was erased. A murmur moved through the crowd, not words, shivers. Someone gasped. Another backed away. Mirrors began to fog. He stepped onto the fountain's edge, its water perfectly still, and dropped the ash. It spread across the surface like ink. And from it a voice rose, hers, Lilith's, but not in anger, in song. A lullaby made of vowels and bone and rivers, a hymn for the unborn and the never remembered. The square froze, faces turned, reflections cracked. A girl wept, her hands shaking at her sides. A mother whispered a name she'd never said aloud, and from one window above a candle lit itself. Then another, then 10, then none, because the city remembered how to be still, not to forget, to feel. Would you have walked into a city that mirrors only itself? Would you have named the one they erased beneath statues of their own invention? Would you have poured ash into the water just to prove it could burn? Ilya stepped down. The cloth is now empty, but the air is now full, and behind him someone began to sing. A woman, alone, then 2, then 7, and the city of mirrors no longer gleamed. It blinked, then closed its eyes, and finally listened. By dusk, the fire cracked sideways, not in earth, not in sky, but in the air between mouths that had not spoken truth in generations. The mirror city rippled like heat over stone, its towers swaying as though ashamed. Reflection had turned to exposure. The mirrors, once content to echo, were now forced to remember what they had chosen not to see. Ilya stood alone in the square, but the air around him pulsed. The song had not stopped. It had multiplied. A girl had begun it, but now the streets hummed with it. Women at windows, women in robes. Women who had been told to lower their eyes, each adding their breath to a hymn older than language. And it wasn't loud, it was full. The kind of sound that seeps into walls, not to break them, but to unmake the forgetting they were built with. Ilya sat on the steps beside the fountain. The ashes were gone. The cloth was folded, but the flame inside him had never been brighter. He had not spoken since noon. He didn't need to. The silence had turned. The city no longer silenced women. It had begun to silence itself. The kind of quiet that listens, the kind that asks. One by one they came to him, not in procession, not in awe, in need. They knelt, they whispered. They handed him slips of fabric, scraps from veils, from sleeves, from torn pages hidden under beds. Each held a word, a name. He did not read them. He folded them into a single satchel, carried them like fire. And when the last woman stepped back into the dusk, the sky above them cracked with light. Not lightning, memory. 1,000 soft streaks of gold falling slow, folding into the streets like forgotten snow. Each ember that landed sang, not with sound, with recognition. She was here. She is still here. We remember. The towers wept, not with water, with light. Mirrors melted, walls leaned, but the city did not fall. It rested, like a beast long caged, finally exhaling. Ilya stood, walked to the center of the square, and whispered, "She forgave you." The wind moved through the city for the first time in centuries. It did not scream. It kissed every door, and left the scent of fig smoke and holy dust. By dusk, the gates had opened, but no one fled. There was no need to run from a fire that only burned the lie. He walked out alone, the satchel of names at his side, the wind behind him, and for the first time since he'd entered the mountain, he felt the fire crack not in protest, but in blessing. Would you have left the flame behind just to stay safe in your silence? Would you have wrapped your truth in a mirror, hoping no one would look too deep? Would you have remembered her if no one came to remind you? The road ahead stretched long, but it breathed. And far ahead he saw smoke curling from a low house built of mud and old prayer. A place no one important remembered, but the flame did, and it leaned toward it like a child finding its mother's name. He walked, as the fire followed, as the sky stitched itself with stars who blinked now not in doubt, but in joy. By nightfall, the silence forgot the names of men, not with thunder, not with anger, but with grace. The kind of forgetting that feels like mercy. The kind of forgetting that makes room. That sets down the stone so the river can return. That clears the altar so a different fire may speak. Ilya walked the final stretch of the road beneath a sky swollen with stars. The fire within him pulsed low but steady, like the heartbeat of a child asleep inside his chest. The satchel of names pressed softly against his side. Each name inside it hummed. Each name wanted to be placed, not on pedestals, not on scrolls, on earth, in the air, in breath. The small house came into view, built from red clay, walls leaning slightly as if exhaling after holding too much weight. A single lantern hung in the doorway, flickering like a heartbeat that had survived centuries of forgetting. He stepped through the threshold. No door barred him, only a silence that asked, not warned. Inside, a woman stood over a basin. Her back was straight. Her hair is bound in salt and shadow. Her hands moved slowly as if they were still remembering how to shape prayer. Did not turn, but she spoke. "You've carried her." He nodded, though she could not see it. "Yes, you've burned the forgetting. I've tried. You've taken their names into your chest. They asked to be held." She turned. Her eyes were older than the hills, not aged, ancient. She walked toward him and placed a bowl at his feet filled with earth black and fine. "You must bury them," she said. "The names," she nodded, "each in its own breath of ground, no two in the same shadow." He knelt, opened the satchel. The names inside shivered like leaves too long hidden from wind. He reached for the first and whispered it. The earth opened. He placed it in and covered it gently. No stone, just silence, and from the soil a flicker of light, the color of birth. The woman did not speak again, but she brought him water and candles and silence and space, and for hours or days he buried names, not all at once, one by one, each name spoken aloud, each name placed with care, each name followed by a moment of silence where the wind bowed its head. When he finished, the bowl was empty, but the house was not. From every corner a warmth had begun to rise. The walls no longer leaned, they listened, and the lantern in the doorway flared gold. He looked to the woman. "I have no name," he said. "You never needed one," she replied. And then she walked to the far wall, pressed her hand to the clay, and a doorway opened, one not shaped by man, but by memory. "Go," she said. "Where?" "Where the wind waits." He stepped through and found himself beneath a sky that glowed like skin, and in the distance a forest made of sound, leaves that sang, rivers that spoke, stones that wept. He walked toward it, the earth beneath his feet lit with every step. The fire within him no longer cracked, it poured. And from the stars above, one final voice. "She is not finished, she is not fading, she is becoming." The silence bowed, and forgot the names of men, so hers could rise again. At first light the ravens still sang, but now their song trembled with tenderness. Not warning, not mourning, but something softer, as if they too had rested, as if even the wings of watchful things needed silence to mend. They flew over the forest Ilya now entered, slow and wide, dipping low through the canopy as though bowing to something older than flight. The trees were vast, not tall, deep. Their roots knotted into one another beneath the soil like memory refusing to be separated. And the leaves, they moved without wind, rustling in rhythms that felt like language. He stepped beneath their shade, and the fire inside his chest pulsed once, then stilled. This place was sacred, not because it was known, because it was never named. There were no paths here, only trust. Ilya walked, letting the forest guide him, the light slipping through leaves in threads, narrow, golden, almost shy. The satchel was gone. His hands were empty, but each step felt heavier now, not with burden, with fullness. He was no longer carrying her memory. He was made of it. The trees parted for him, not physically, but gently, the way a mother moves a curtain so her child can sleep just a little longer. And as he moved deeper, the sounds changed. Birdsong gave way to breath. Insects gave way to silence. And the silence gave way to her, not her body, not her voice, her presence. It came like mist curling through his ribs, soft, sure, sacred. He closed his eyes, and Lilith was there, not standing, not hovering, becoming the sound in the trees, the heat in the roots, the hush in the light, the name behind the silence. He fell to his knees and did not speak, but she did, from within him. They thought I was alone. The trees bowed. They thought forgetting would finish me. The air grew warm. But every time they buried me, they planted me. He wept, she continued. I did not leave the garden, I took it with me. And around him the forest bloomed. Flowers opened with no sound. Sap rose like a song, and above the ravens turned in unison. Lilith's voice curled around his bones. You are not my prophet, you are not my priest, you are the breath I left behind. He whispered, am I still burning? And she answered, you are the fire they couldn't see, the one they lit without knowing. A tree ahead cracked, not with rot, but with birth. Its bark split gently down the center, and from within came a single branch curved like a question, wrapped in silver moss, glowing faintly. He rose, took it. And it hummed in his hand, not with magic, with memory. She spoke once more. Go where they do not speak my name and say nothing. Only walk, the fire will follow. And just like that, the forest leaned back. The light widened. The breath of the world returned, and Ilya walked on, not with purpose, with presence. He passed stones carved with nothing but fingerprints. He stepped over roots that pulsed like heartbeats. And everywhere he went, the fire inside him did not flare, it listened. The forest, once wild, now breathed in rhythm. And above, the ravens no longer circled. They flew forward, toward cities still asleep, toward temples still locked, toward waters still waiting. And in Ilya's hand the branch of memory glowed, a torch without flame, a voice without sound. A woman remembered not through scripture, but through every step he took. By noon the sky no longer blinked. It watched without judgment, without pride, without defense. It watched the world as one watches a child awaken, gently, quietly, holding its breath for what might come next. Clouds hung still, as if listening to the forest, as if even they had stopped to hear the footsteps of a man who now walked with no voice and yet carried one. Ilya moved through the trees, the branch in his hand warm and alive. He did not speak. He didn't need to. The branch's remembered foe. Arhim, wherever he passed, the forest stirred not in noise but in feeling. Buds bloomed without sunlight. Birds flew in wide, slow arcs. Stones turned faintly toward him as though trying to recall his shape. And deep beneath his steps the earth exhaled, not because it was relieved, because it was heard. He reached a clearing by midday, a wide circle of silence ringed by blackened stumps. The ground here was not green, it was ash. Sky above was clearer than any he had seen, yet something heavy clung to the air. He knelt and touched the ash. It clung to his fingers, warm, old. He closed his eyes, and the forest showed him a fire once raged here, not the kind that devours trees, the kind that silences women. He saw them, a dozen gathered in a circle, palms up, eyes closed. They had not cursed, they had not fought, they had remembered. And the world around them had not known what to do with that, so it burned the grove. But not the memory, never the memory. He rose slowly, lifted the branch, and the ash beneath him began to move, circling, rising, swirling like a wind made of grief. He didn't flinch, he let it cover him, and when it touched the branch it caught fire, not with heat, with names. One by one they lit in the air, spoken not by lips but by presence. Kezia, Aner, Juna, the one who lit the moon with her breath, the one who taught silence to sing. And then her name, Lilith. Not shouted, returned. The grove shifted. Trees that had never grown there began to emerge, not saplings, memories. Figures shaped from shadow and gold, from roots and breath. Women, dozens, hundreds. They surrounded him, not with awe, with belonging. Each held a flame in their palm, not flickering, still, like the moment before a word. He stood in their midst and whispered, "I carry nothing." One stepped forward, touched the branch, and said, "You carry everything." The flames in their hands rose, not higher, not louder, wider. And from the edge of the grove a gate appeared, carved not from wood but from air, a frame of wind and whisper. Behind it the world beyond the forest, the city still built on forgetting, the altars still heavy with names not their own, the towers still dressed in veils and gold. He stepped toward it. The women parted, not to release him, to walk with him. He turned back to the forest once, and it bowed, not the trees, the silence. He stepped through the gate, and the air beyond tasted of stone. He had entered the outer world, but the fire had come with him, and now so had they. By dusk, the fire cracked sideways, not up to the heavens, not down into the earth, but across the breadth of the world, moving like a tear across old silk. It touched things hidden in plain sight. It warmed statues no one had noticed in years. It whispered beneath temple doors that had not opened since the first forgetting. Ilya stepped into a city of stone. The air there was tight, as if every street held its breath. The people walked quickly, heads low, lips closed, as though too many truths had once tried to rise and been choked back. But the fire followed him, and so did they. The women of the grove, not as an army, not as a storm, as a prayer finally remembered. They walked in silence, not to be small, to be sacred. And wherever they passed, the walls shifted. A mural faded to reveal a mother once scrubbed from it. A tower's shadow shortened, ashamed of how long it had hidden the sun. A fountain began to bleed light, not water, light, and the people looked up, not all at once, but slowly. A child dropped a coin meant for wishing, and the coin rolled backward to Ilya's feet. He picked it up, pressed it to the branch, and whispered, "What do you wish?" The coin pulsed once, then cracked, not broken, but opened. Inside it, a name, Nama. He placed it into the light, and it did not burn. It became windy. From every alley women stepped out, some young, some bent with years. Some had never spoken, some had never stopped. Each one took a place behind Ilya, and their presence softened the city, not with apology, with truth. They reached the plaza where judgments were once carved into stone, where no one wept aloud, where the accused were asked to kneel not for mercy but for silence. Ilya walked to its center. The branch is still warm, still breathing, and he did not raise his voice. Simply said, "She is not gone." The wind paused, the fire cracked sideways, a tremble passed beneath the stones. A voice not his spoke from the branch. "I am the one they buried beneath language, the one they clothed in shame to hide their fear, the one who did not fall but who stepped aside so the story could breathe again." And around him the city began to listen. Shutters opened. Men lowered their swords. Children stopped reciting the names of kings, and someone knelt, not to worship, to remember. Ilya lifted the branch, and it began to bloom. Tiny flames curled like petals from its wood, each one bearing a name long hidden. The branch became a garden. The garden became a sky, and from that sky 1,000 voices descended, not loud, sacred, each saying the same thing: "We are still here." The fire cracked sideways, and the walls did not fall, they wept. Would you have walked into a city that forgot your name just to help it remember its own? Would you have carried her silence knowing it might burn through you? Would you have dared to plant a garden in stone? Ilya turned once more to the crowd, and without speaking he knelt, the branch at his side, the fire in his spine, and one by one the people knelt with him, not because they were told, because the ground itself had begun to whisper her name. By nightfall, the silence forgot the names of men, not as rebellion, not as revenge, but as release. The great forgetting had begun to lift, not with trumpet or sword, but with a sigh so deep the earth's oldest bones stirred to listen. Cities once carved from command began to soften at the edges, as if the stone no longer wished to hold the shape of forgetting. Ilya knelt at the center of the old plaza, and the world knelt with him. The sky dimmed not in mourning, but in reverence, stars holding back their shine as if to give the fire its final word. The branch at his side no longer burned. It bloomed, a bloom made of memory, of names, of every breath ever silenced for daring to speak her truth. Lilith's presence rose like a tide through the city, not visible, not loud, but unmistakable, in the way the fountains wept without being touched. In this way the iron gates unlatched themselves, on the way a child turned toward the east where the stars had gathered close. And then, without warning, a tremble beneath Ilya's knees, not an earthquake, a heartbeat. The city was waking, not to alarm, to memory. From beneath the stones, voices began to rise, soft, feminine, unforgot. The stones did not crack. They spoke, words etched deep, now resurfaced. Here she knelt, here she bled, here she waited for them to remember her face. And around the plaza, figures emerged from alleyways, balconies, doorways, faces Ilya had never seen but somehow always known. They were not ghosts. They were echoes finally given bodies. Women who had disappeared from scrolls, daughters unnamed in tombs, scribes whose ink had been stolen. One by one they gathered, not around him, around the branch, the bloom. The fire now soft as breath. A woman with silver skin placed her hand upon it and whispered, "Let it be planted." Ilya nodded and dug his hands into the stone. The plaza gave way like softened clay, and into its heart he placed the branch, covered it not with dirt, with silence, the good kind, the listening kind, the kind that makes a space sacred. He stood, and no one moved until the sky cracked, not in fury, in fullness. From that crack a single drop of golden rain fell. It struck the earth above the branch, and where it landed a tree rose, instant, wide, old, a tree not of time but of truth. Its bark is etched with names, its leaves are shaped like open eyes, and from its roots the sound of her voice, "You remembered me." The city wept, not with shame, with awe, because now finally there would be no more forgetting, not while the tree breathed, not while the names sang, not while the fire slept beneath stone and silence. Ilya turned to leave. No one stopped him. They did not need to follow. The tree would speak now. And the silence had learned to listen. As he stepped out of the plaza, the stars above blinked awake once more, not with question, with blessing. The road ahead curled like a ribbon of smoke, leading him toward a horizon where old mountains waited with open hands. And behind him, the city did not sleep. It was a dream. Would you have left your name behind just to make room for the names they buried? Would you have cracked the silence if it meant forgetting yourself? Would you have become fire just to warm those who tried to extinguish you? He walked, and the tree behind him glowed, and from its highest branch a raven took flight, carrying no scroll, no sword, just a whisper. Lilith. At first light the ravens still sang, but their voices had changed. No longer cries of omen, nor echoes of grief. They sang with clarity now, with memories made whole. Their wings stretched wide over the valleys, and their shadows traced the path Ilya now walked, a narrow trail of broken salt and frost that led toward a land where names were numbers, and silence was enforced, not sacred. The city had faded behind him like a dream that chose to remain. Ahead, the realm of the scribes, not scribes of spirit, scribes of law, of rule, of ledger. Their robes were pale, their lips are thin, their temples towering, polished with absence. And every word they wrote in stone, so it could not be undone. Ilya stepped onto their threshold and felt the cold wrap around his ankle. Ease not like wind, but like a question that doubted his fire. The branch had remained buried in the plaza, but the flame still pulsed inside his ribs. A softer warmth now, not seeking, not burning, just being. A sentinel of all he had carried. He did not rush. He walked as memory does, slowly, with weight. The first scribe appeared from behind a pillar, face painted with ivory dust. He did not speak. He offered a scroll, a blank one, and a chisel. "Write your worth," the silence said. "Carve your permission." Ilya did neither. He bowed not low but steady and whispered, "She is already writ." The scribe said nothing, but his eyes narrowed. He stepped aside. The gate opened, not willingly, with wonder. Inside, the halls curved like dried rivers. Straight lines were forbidden here. Everything looped, everything returned. Every corridor ended where it began. That was their law. All must return to the beginning. All must be accounted for. But Ilya had walked with names. Names were not numbers. They didn't return to the beginning, they made it. He walked deeper, past rows of statues with blank faces, past rooms where monks counted breaths instead of prayers. And finally he reached the chamber of the great unspoken, a round room, no doors, no windows, just a single flame hovering in the air. And beneath it a slab of black stone, untouched. He knelt, and the flame flickered, not in approval, in remembrance. His voice broke the hush, but gently. "I have nothing to write about, only to remember." The flame flared once, the stone hissed, and from the edges of the chamber a voice answered, old, layered, neither man nor woman. "Then speak, but only in silence." He closed his eyes, and did. He remembered her laughter when the stars first bloomed. He remembered her hands lifting clay that dared to breathe. He remembered the way she left the garden, not weeping, but walking backward, facing the truth. He remembered the mountain where her name was carved into wind. He remembered every woman who had once looked at the fire and said, "Let me carry it." The stone trembled and cracked. A thin line first, then another and another, until the slab split, not in violence, in opening. From the fracture a wind rose, warm, scented with myrrh and ash, and with it a single whisper, "She is enough." The flame lowered. The ravens circled above the dome. And somewhere far away the first leaf of the tree opened its eyes. Would you have entered the halls of those who measured truth, just to remind them it could not be counted? Would you have stood in a circle of forgetting with only silence as your offering? Would you have walked where names were erased, carrying only breath? Ilya opened his eyes, and the flame before him bowed. He rose, not above the scribes, but with the names, and walked back toward the world. Toward dusk, toward the voice. By noon the sky no longer blinked. It watched with wide, unflinching eyes, as if afraid to miss what was finally returning. The wind moved in slow spirals now, not rushing, not resisting, but guiding toward a place the world had almost forgotten, but which had never forgotten the world. Ilya followed the spirals, through the hills where words had no place, past rivers that ran backward, into a forest not marked on any map. The trees here grew in silence. Not the hollow silence of absence, the living silence of breath withheld in reverence. Their trunks were black, not from fire, but from memory pressed deep into bark. Their leaves shimmered silver green, and every time they stirred, they sang no song. They remembered one. He stepped gently, and the earth did not sink. It rose to meet him. The deeper he walked, the warmer the air became. Not hot, known, as though the very roots recognized his feet. And then, without warning, the clearing. A circle of stone benches around a hollow of earth. No shrine, no statue, only a single seed, hovering, glowing, spinning slowly in place as if caught in the breath of a god. He did not approach it, not yet. He knelt and waited. He didn't know what, but something in his bones did. And then from the edges of the grove they came, not women, not men. The nameless, hooded, hands stained with soil and firelight. They circled him, slow and barefoot, their steps pressing rhythms into the ground. With every movement the grove pulsed, not with power but with memory returning. One of them knelt beside Ilya, no words, only touch, a single hand to his shoulder, and then she spoke. The root never forgot her, but the world feared what would grow. Another voice: they erased her from stone, but not from seed. The seed spun faster now. Colors flickered through it: fire, blood, water, sky. A heartbeat echoed from its core. Ilya whispered, "Why me?" And the answer came not from them, but from within, because you listened. He wept, not because he was sad, because he was seen. The nameless stood in unison, lifted their hands, and from Uri fingertip rose a thread of light, hundreds golden, trembling, weaving toward the seed. The seed pulsed once more and dropped, not down, inward, into the soil. The threads followed, and the grove shook not from weight but from birth. From that hollow a stem rose, then a bud, then a flower that opened without season. Its petals were shaped like ears, its scent like a name, and from it a voice. I was not erased, I was waiting. The nameless bowed low. Ilya stood. He stepped to the flower, placed both hands around it, and it did not burn. It bloomed wider, and whispered to him alone, now take me to where forgetting still rules. He nodded, and the stem wrapped itself around his wrist. A living flame, a memory in bloom. He turned to the nameless. They were already gone, only footprints remained, and even those began to fade, not as loss, as offering. He walked from the grove, carrying no scripture, no law, only the flower of the first voice, and behind him the grove exhaled. As if the long wait had ended, would you have walked into the forest where even the stars held their breath? Would you have knelt before what could not be named? Would you have carried a seed you could never own, only protect? The sky did not blink, it followed. By dusk, the fire cracked sideways, not up in defiance, not down in surrender, but across, like a blade of dusk light slicing through glass temples. The horizon bent as though it too were remembering how to kneel. Even the sun, which had always dictated the pace of things, seemed to pause, caught in that thin breath between remembering and revelation. Ilya stepped into the city of mirrors. No walls of stone, no statues of kings, only towers of light that reflected nothing. They swallowed memory and cast back only silence shaped to resemble obedience. No names were spoken here, only roles, only ranks, only rules passed down like inheritance. Even the wind was numbered. But Ilya walked through it, flowers on his wrist glowing faintly beneath his sleeve. It pulsed not with power but with promise, and each time it beat, another mirror quivered, not from heat but from recognition. They saw him coming. Not the guards, the reflections. The city had spent lifetimes perfecting its forgetting. And here was a man who carried a name they'd buried so deep they could no longer dream it. He passed a courtyard where voices once echoed with judgment. Now it sat empty, polished to the point of vanishing. But when Ilya stepped inside, the air changed. The silence didn't leave, it shuddered. And the glass around him began to show things no one had dared to look for. A woman's footprint at the edge of the garden. A scroll burned in haste, still singing beneath the ash. A cradle overturned not by wind, but by refusal. He placed his hand on one pane of glass, and the flower on his wrist bloomed. Petals pressed outward, not into air, into memory. The glass hissed, split, and behind it a hallway no one remembered having built. He walked through. Each step rewrote a wall, not with ink, with light. And soon the mirrors no longer reflected his face. They reflected hers, Lilith, not monstrous, not defiant, still, whole, weeping not in regret, in joy. Somewhere above, alarms cried soft, unsure, like children told to scream without knowing why. Guards appeared at the edge of vision, clad in white, eyes veiled, hands gloved. They did not speak. They did not charge. They froze because the flower had begun to sing. A single note, long, low, and layered with every voice that had ever whispered her name in secret. Their weapons rusted in their hands. Their veils burned, not to wound, to reveal. One dropped to their knees, then another, then all. The flower's light filled the towers now, sliding through glass like rivers of remembering, and every surface cracked, not in collapse, in release. Reflections changed. No more polished masks. No more titles etched in light. Only stories, only faces, only names. He passed through the center tower, the highest hall. The place where forgetting had once sat on a throne of gold. It was empty now, only a chair. And a basin of water so still it held no image. He stepped to it. The flower dipped a single petal into the water, and it turned black, not with death, with ink. From it rose a script written in a language older than vowels, etched in movement, not lines. And in the center of that dance one name pulsed. Lilith. He knelt, not because he was tired, because the fire inside him had remembered its source. The water rose, circling him once, then vanished, and behind him the throne cracked. A single whisper escaped from its break. She was never meant to be forgotten. Would you have walked into the heart of erasure carrying only a bloom? Would you have let your shadow vanish if it meant the truth could cast one? Would you have faced a mirror that never showed you just to let it see her? The towers dimmed, the sky deepened, and Ilya turned too. Leave. The city did not follow, it bowed. By nightfall, the silence forgot the names of men not as punishment but as cleansing. The air thickened with remembering, and every breath became a page torn from a book no one admitted had ever been written. The towers did not fall. They dimmed, and in that dimness the world exhaled for the first time in generations, without fear of being overheard. Ilya stood at the gate of the city, though the gate itself no longer held weight. It had become a frame now, a broken bracket in the story. The guards did not speak as he passed. Their armor had unraveled into robes. Their hands, once clenched, now cradled the light. The flower on his wrist pulsed slower, deeper, as if it too felt the nearing end of something sacred. But before the road could lead him beyond, it pulled him down, not into despair, into the earth, into the last unspoken place. He followed without question. The ground beneath him parted not in violence but in invitation. Roots uncurled, stones breathed, and a path of ash and bone wound downward, lit only by the fire inside him. This was the chamber of the first silence, the place where Lilith's voice had been taken not by force but by agreement, a pact older than Eden, older than breath. He stepped into the hollow. It pulsed like a forgotten womb. At the center stood a pillar made not of stone but of condensed shadow. It swayed gently as if it were listening before choosing to remain. He approached. The flower bloomed once more. Its petals fell not to the ground, to the shadow, and the pillar rippled. From it a figure began to emerge, not flesh, not a ghost, memory, Lilith, but not as he had seen her before. She wore the shape of silence, and her eyes held not fire but stillness. She spoke, but not aloud. They did not erase me. They harvested the quiet I carried. Ilya wept. But the tears did not fall. They rose, forming a circle around him, droplets suspended in the chamber like stars remembering how to shine. Lilith stepped closer, and now her voice came, soft as the breath before lightning. Do you know what they feared? Not my refusal, my remembering. He knelt. Then I will carry it. She shook her head. No, you will plant it. The last petal of the flower curled into light, and from it a seed, small, gray, humming with the sound of a name unsaid for too long. She opened her palm. He placed it there, but she did not close her hand. She offered it back. Plant it where forgetting is law. Plant it where silence is currency. Plant it where the wind has no name. He nodded, and with that she faded, not into nothing, into everything. The shadow pillar crumbled. The chamber began to rise around him, lifting him back through soil and stone, through layers of history, through generations of we don't speak of that, until the stars blinked overhead once more. The silence, it was different now, not heavy, not hesitant, sacred, a silence that held space, a silence that made room. He stepped from the broken city, the wind bowed, the stars stood guard, and in his hand the seed pulsed. Would you have followed the memory underground, knowing it might never let you leave? Would you have planted what could not be harvested? Would you have walked into the first silence and waited until it sang? The night held its breath, and in that breath her name rose again, Lilith. At first light the ravens still sang, but now their song was a thread woven from all the voices Ilya had heard since the beginning. Lilith's laughter, the cries of the forgotten, the chant of the nameless, even the low silence of the stones, it was all there, layered, rising like mist from the grass. They did not fly ahead. They circled him, not as omen, as guardians. The path before him was not marked. It never had been. He walked where the seed pulled him gently, firmly, like a mother guiding a child who cannot yet speak. He crossed no borders. He passed no signs, but he knew when he had entered it. The place where even time forgot its name. It looked like nothing, but it felt like everything. The air here carried no scent. The sky above blinked in and out, clouds coming and going with no wind to move them. And the trees, there were none, only stumps, not cut, not burned, remembered. They had finished what they came to do. This was the soil of conclusion, the ground where every name eventually came to sleep. Here not even echoes dared to linger. Ilya knelt. The seed in his palm was warm now, not from fire but from trust. He dug no hole. The earth parted on its own. The seed dropped as if it had always known its place. And when it touched soil, the wind vanished, not out of fear, out of reverence. A hum began, low, sacred. A vibration beneath his knees that rose slowly through his spine, through his chest, until his breath moved without his will, his lungs following the pulse of the ground. The seed did not sprout, it sang, a single note, so clear, O ancient, that the sky above paused. And from that note the name emerged, not spoken, revealed, Lilith, no longer hidden, no longer rewritten, no longer whispered only at night. The ground glowed beneath him, and from it rose visions, not memories, not futures, but truths. He saw her walking out of the garden, not in shame, but in strength. He saw her watching from mountains, from rivers, from the edge of the moon. He saw her touch the first fire before man learned to fear it. He saw every time she was called a demon, yet held the child anyway. He saw every moment she was blamed, yet remained. He saw every silence and every scream. And through it all she never disappeared, she waited, until one soul would remember enough to return. He bowed, not in worship, in completion. The seed had not grown a tree, it had grown a veil, thin, golden, and through it he saw not her but all of them. The ones who carried memory when the world made it a crime. The ones who spoke when silence was safer. The ones who named themselves when no one else would. Would you have planted a seed you would never see bloom? Would you have knelt in the soil where time forgets just to give memory a place to rest? Would you have risked your voice to make space for hers? The light thickened, the veil shimmered, and something unseen, something holy exhaled. By noon, the sky no longer blinked. It stared wide and unclouded as if it had waited eternity for this one breath. Light pooled across the veil, not in beams, but in pulses, as if the sky itself had begun to breathe in rhythm with the name that had returned. Ilya stood still in the hush. Not a single wind stirred, but something deeper did, the hush before thunder, the sacred ache that comes when the silence no longer needs to be kept. Beneath his feet the ground no longer hummed, it listened. The seed had become light, and the light had become a root that passed not into soil but into memory, threading back through every city, every name, every burned page and broken mouth that once tried to say her name. Now it flowed backward. The past was being rewoven, not changed, revealed, and then from the veil she stepped. Lilith, not as a memory, not as a symbol, as herself. She was neither young nor old, neither sorrowful nor victorious. She was exactly as the world had tried to forget, whole. Her eyes found his, and he felt no fear, only stillness, the kind of stillness that existed before the first light. She walked to him, barefoot, breath steady. The wind returned only to kiss her ankles, bowing without noise. She placed a hand to his chest and spoke. "You did not awaken me, you unbound me." He did not speak. There were no words left that hadn't already been shed like leaves. She turned to the veil, and it answered her without question. From its shimmer, 1,000 voices rose, women who had hidden in caves, who had healed without permission, who had led while pretending to follow. Men who had kept her memory alive in secret, in ink, in lullabies whispered to daughters they weren't allowed to name after her. Now the veil gave them back. One by one they stepped through, not into the world, into truth. Their faces are not radiant but real. Their bodies are marked not by divinity but by survival. They gathered around the place where the seed had been planted. They sat, they listened. Lilith spoke again. "You do not have to shout a name to remember it. You do not have to win to endure. You only have to remain." And they had, all of them, through centuries of silence, through tongues cut and books buried, through dreams turned to dust, they had remained. The veil widened and began to move, not across land but across memory. Cities stirred, stones shifted, fires long extinguished breathed once more. Even the oceans tilted their ears, wondering if they too had once known her. Ilya wept, not from sadness, from release, from the strange, holy ache of being present when something sacred returns to itself. And still Lilith stood not as queen, not as a mother, as a witness to herself, to the breath that had always been hers. The noon light curved around her shoulders. Time no longer dared to pass. It hovered, wide-eyed, learning her shape again. Would you have stood in the place where time forgot, just to remember what never truly left? Would you have looked her in the eye not to worship but to understand? Would you have carried silence long enough for it to speak? The wind did not howl, it whispered a name. By dusk the fire cracked sideways. It did not rise to consume, it did not fall to fade. It moved across the earth, low, wide, patient, like the hand of God smoothing the creases of a forgotten book. Everywhere it touched, the stones began to whisper, not loud, but clearly. Not in language, in remembering. The city of mirrors, now half in ruin, half in bloom, felt it first. Their towers, long emptied of meaning, caught fire that did not burn, only reveal. Lead glass that once refused to reflect now showed faces long erased. A mother feeding her child by moonlight. A woman stitching names into the hem of a robe she'd never wear. A girl speaking aloud the story of the garden even when no one believed her tongue. These reflections did not flicker, they stayed, like stars that no longer needed night to shine. In the city where the throne of forgetting once stood, the golden basin now filled with ink again, but no longer to blot, to record. The walls around it, cracked by Ilya's passing, widened on their own and began to write themselves in firelight, inscribing Lilith's name in patterns of wind, water, bone. And in every village, every cave, every cradle where her story had been whispered in fear, the fire passed gently and left a bloom behind. Not a monument, a seed. Not to be seen, to be known. Ilya stood at the edge of the veil, watching the dusk catch the world in its amber breath. Beside him, Lilith did not speak. She was listening to everything, and for the first time since the garden, the world was listening back. The veil was no longer needed. It folded gently like wings at rest and returned to the earth as light, seeping into roots, into rivers, into the breath of newborns who would one day ask, why didn't they tell her story too? She turned to him, face soft with the ache of having been remembered. It is done. He nodded, and yet something remained, not a task, a question. He had carried her memory, but what now? She stepped closer, placed her hand on his heart and whispered, now you carry yours. And in that moment Ilya saw it. The fire was not hers, it was his. The seed was not her voice, it was his permission to speak. The journey had never been only to restore her. It was to awaken him and all who had been taught to forget the truth that did not serve power. He wept again, but this time the tears glowed, not from pain, from inheritance. Would you have lit the fire knowing it might show what others begged to keep hidden? Would you have stood beside a woman called Myth and remembered her as mother? Would you have let your silence crack sideways just to see what tried to grow beneath? The sun bent low. The fire slipped further, tracing its last lines across the edge of the world. But one spark, one sacred ember refused to fall. It hovered, waiting. By nightfall, the silence forgot the names of men, not from malice, not from revolt. From mercy, it let them go, the names written in fear, spoken in conquest, passed down not as blessings but as warnings. The silence released them like birds too long caged, and in their place it kept only one thing, a pulse. Not a word, not even a name, just the sound of remembering. Ilya stood in the field where the veil had folded. The seed's warmth was gone now, not because it had died, because it had entered everything. He breathed in. The wind had returned, but softer. It did not howl or whisper. It moved like a prayer with no speaker. The stars above did not blink. They held their eyes open, wide, aching, ready, as though the sky itself was watching the story it had forgotten unfold again. Lilith stood at the edge of it all, looking not at him but beyond, into a place no eye could follow, a place deeper than distance, closer than memory. He stepped toward her. She did not turn, because she was already within him now. He understood. She had never wanted a throne, she had only wanted to remain, and now she would, in every silence, in every fire, in every stone that remembered how to crack. He reached into the air, and it responded not as servant, not as proof, but as kin. The wind moved through his fingers as if to say, "We see you now." He closed his eyes, and in that final darkness he saw them all. The mothers who gave without names, the daughters who carried forbidden songs, the fathers who kept stories buried in the folds of their robes, waiting for one moment, one son brave enough to ask. The silence wrapped around him. It no longer needed to speak. It no longer needed to hide. It had become holy, not because it was sacred, because it was finally shared. He knelt not in devotion, but in peace. And the earth, which once opened to swallow memory, now opened only to receive it. The fire was gone, but the warmth remained. And in that warmth, something unspoken passed between heaven and the hollow spaces of the world. Not a voice, not a vow, just presence, just the truth. Would you have stayed even when the fire left? Would you have trusted the silence when it no longer needed to speak? Would you have let go of your name just to keep someone else safe? The stars did not blink. The ravens did not sing. The world held its breath. And then nothing, not emptiness, fullness too wide for sound. And if the silence never broke, would your faith still rise in the dark? What if the last word God spoke was goodbye?